So we recently purchased a home and moved in November 2nd, 2019. But we've only been there for about 1.5 weeks at this point, and within that time we've had 3 really odd experiences, all occurring between 1:30 and 2:30 in the morning on different nights. So the first experience and the second night in the home, after a tiff with the wife, I decided to sleep in our nicely finished basement. I went to sleep at around 10 p.m, woke at around 12 p.m. to the sound of footsteps on carpet. I thought it might have been the kids sneaking around. They get out of bed at night and come to our room. I looked up, but didn't see anything. I checked the time on my phone, but didn't think much of it, and I just went back to sleep. Around 1:30, I heard the footsteps again, and this time it sounded like more than one person. I thought it was my wife and kids coming down to find me, so I looked up from the futon, but I didn't see anyone. I started to feel a bit creeped out by this because I definitely heard footsteps, but I thought it was all in my head, and I just tried to go back to sleep. But within a minute of laying back down, I felt someone lean on me with their arms. I freaked out because there was no one there. I threw my covers off and ran upstairs and got in bed with my wife. I convinced myself at the time that it was just in my head because I was in a liminal sleep state or something. The second experience, about 3 days after that night, the home has an integrated fire alarm system, so when one alarm goes off, they all go off. It's around 2 a.m. and we're all sleeping upstairs when all of a sudden the fire alarm goes off. My wife and I get up to investigate, and within 20 seconds the alarm stops. We just chalked it up to the system doing an auto test because, well, what else could it be? We go back to bed, but we're both a little bit creeped out and on high alert. Now, the third experience was about a week after night 2. This was last night, and this is what caused me to make this post. So, I was sleeping in my toddler's bed with her to help her to get to sleep. My wife was sleeping with our 6-year-old in our bedroom, and around 1:30 my toddler woke up and went to my wife. I saw her leave, and I continued to sleep. And around 1:40, my wife runs into the room where I was sleeping, turns on all the lights along the way, yelling that there was somebody in the house. She said that she and my toddler heard a deep man's voice speaking on the first level of the home. Now, I'm very freaked out, and I think that it's a home intruder. I turn on all the downstairs lights from the top of the stairs. I yell that I'm calling the police. There aren't any sounds of movement, so I muster my courage and I head downstairs to investigate. My heart is racing, and I go into the kitchen to grab a kitchen knife and begin exploring the house. And, long story short, I find nothing. The doors are locked, the windows are locked, the garage is closed. I go back upstairs and fall asleep after about an hour when my adrenaline finally dissipates, and my poor wife can't sleep for the rest of the night. So, what do you guys think's going on? The house is not old, built in 2002. The family we purchased it from built the home themselves and were the only occupants. No one's died here, and I don't really believe in ghosts, and this house does not seem like a candidate for such activity anyways. Is it all just coincidence? Do you guys have any plausible ideas? I really can't find a reasonable explanation for what happened that night. It was just a strange and really alarming experience. It all happened a few months ago. My friend had heard that the northern lights might be visible in our area and asked if I wanted to go for a drive and to the country to see if we could catch a glimpse. So we headed out after dark and we drove for a few hours, just searching for a good vantage point basically. But after a while, we started to give up on seeing the lights. My friend realized, though, that we were close to her hometown, and noted that she'd been waiting to visit the local cemetery to find the graves of some of her distant relatives. She had recently been researching her genealogy and whatnot. It was a clear and warm night, and we were both a little bit disappointed that we hadn't seen the lights yet. We both wanted to make the trip worthwhile, so we agreed to swing by the cemetery. We found the graves, took some photos, and just wandered around for a little bit. My friend was leading the way, using the flashlight on her phone to light the path and ensure that we didn't accidentally step on any of the graves. I'd been feeling increasingly anxious since we arrived, which struck me as odd. I've done several cemetery projects as an archaeologist and don't normally feel nervous in cemeteries, even at night. In fact, I usually find that cemeteries are pretty peaceful and calming. But I just felt really strange in that cemetery and found myself frequently spinning around because I just felt like someone was standing behind me. Still, I just chalked it up to general anxiety and tried to not dwell on it. One of the many problems with having anxiety disorder is that it's sometimes hard to tell when your nervousness is justified. Even in retrospect, I don't know if my anxiety was just in my head or if it was related to what would happen next. But after wandering for a while, we realized that it was approaching 1 a.m. and that we should probably get back home. We headed toward the car. The car was in sight, and my friend was a few yards ahead of me when it happened. I just suddenly got that nervous feeling again and thought that I had heard someone running up behind me. I was starting to turn my head to look back when I felt something collide with my back, right between my shoulder blades. There was a weight behind it, as if someone had actually hurtled into me. The impact was so forceful that I was thrown forward and fell flat on my face. And as I scrambled to get back up, I felt the weight hitting me in the shoulders again and was shoved back down. I glanced up to see my friend running toward me, as she had also heard someone running up to us, had heard my initial fall, and had turned just in time to see me being pushed back down. She would later tell me that she had seen my hoodie flattening against my back and shifting, as if someone had been pressing their hands against my shoulders. She grabbed my arm to pull me up just as the weight disappeared, and we both just bolted for the car, jumping in and instinctively locking all the doors. She wasted no time, too, starting the engine and then hastily just peeling out of the driveway. And as soon as we hit the road, we just sped away from there. We drove several minutes, just kind of not saying a word. I think we were both just kind of stunned and, more than anything, really confused. She finally glanced at me and said, "What the hell just happened?" And I didn't know quite how to answer that. I told her that someone had shoved me to the ground, and she said, "I know, I saw, but what was that? There was nothing there." We tried to come up with some sort of irrational explanation, but none of them made any sense. Had someone ambushed me and then bolted? Definitely not. We would have seen them for sure. Had I tripped? No, I definitely felt something pushing me, and my friend had seen me being shoved back down as well. Had it been the wind? Not possible. There hadn't been so much as a breeze that night. Perhaps an animal had attacked me, but that didn't seem possible either. I mean, there were no local animals large enough, strong enough, and stealthy enough to topple a full-grown human without being seen like that. Plus, I had been in full view of my friend, illuminated by a flashlight during the second fall, and the weight had remained on my shoulders even as she was coming right up to me. She should have been able to see whatever had been pushing me, but there was just nothing there. In the end, we just couldn't explain it, but whatever had pushed me twice, it hadn't been visible to us. And as the adrenaline faded, I noticed something else as well. My back really hurt. Right between my shoulder blades, right where I had felt the impact, I could feel a sort of stinging or prickling sensation. It felt like my back had been brushed with stinging nettles. I mentioned this to my friend, and she insisted on pulling over to look at my back. She switched the hood light on and pulled the collar of my hoodie down to take a look, and I heard her mutter, "What the hell?" The skin between my shoulder blades was reddened, and several little blisters had started to appear as well. They later swelled up and popped, and it was as if I'd gotten sunburn or a chemical burn. There weren't any scratches or cuts. It was a relatively subtle mark, but it was still clearly there. And we certainly couldn't figure out how I'd gotten burned like that. I hadn't rubbed up against anything, I hadn't touched my back, I'd been wearing my hoodie all night, and there were no tears or marks in the fabric. And man, did it hurt. It continued to sting for several days, in fact, and it was really uncomfortable. In fact, I couldn't even sleep that night. My back hurt, and every time I started to drift off, I'd suddenly sense that someone was standing over my shoulder, and I would startle awake. I couldn't really understand what had happened at the cemetery, but it truly rattled me. I don't know if I believe in things like ghosts or demons, to be honest, but I know that something truly bizarre and frightening happened that night, and my inability to explain it, to account for every strange little detail, was deeply disturbing to me. It's been really difficult to grapple with this. I mean, I already have PTSD from a previous assault, and there is something profoundly unsettling about the fact that, in this instance, there's nothing that I could have done to defend myself. And with no clear explanation for it, there's no way for me to prevent something like this from happening again. I've had several nightmares since then as well, dreams that are similar to the nightmares that I'd had for years when I was growing up. I don't know where they came from, but for as long as I can remember, I've had dreams in which a creature is attempting to lure me in one way or another, and in the dreams I usually understand this creature to be a devil or a demon. Sometimes it takes the form of an old woman. I had a dream when I was about 13 years old in which I was wandering through a forest and I came across a little cottage with this old woman standing by the porch. She beckoned me inside and I acquiesced, and we spent some time casually talking and baking cookies, but I just felt uneasy around her and got the sense that she wanted something from me. At one point, I glanced out the window and I noticed a group of people just standing in the yard, calling out to the old woman. I asked who these people were, and I vividly remember what she told me. They want me to take them in, but I don't want them. I want you. In other dreams, it's had a more sinister appearance, but I always recognize it as the same creature. I sometimes have dreams in which it's sitting in the dark at my bedside, whispering to me. It has a shadowy appearance with long, lanky limbs and empty eye sockets. Its teeth are made of razor wire or something, and there's something like blood or wine gleaming on its lips. In those dreams, I can hear it whispering, but I can't exactly understand what it's saying. Sometimes I have dreams of the same creature sitting in a chair in the corner of my room, eating a rotten apple. I have long suspected that this creature is some sort of a manifestation of my deepest and most troubling fears. And I know that these are just dreams, but I mention it because those dreams had subsided in my early 20s, but the incident at the cemetery rattled me so much that they've kind of returned. This whole experience seems to have shaken my understanding of the world around me, opening the floodgates to my own inner demons. In these new dreams, the creature is standing upright behind me at the cemetery. Time seems to be slowing down. I can see my friend frozen ahead of me, and the creature is whispering at my back. I really don't know why my mind is conflating that dream creature with my encounter at the cemetery, but the fear has increasingly kept me up at night. Anyway, I just wanted to share this because I have no idea what the hell happened that night. My friend believes that it was a ghost, but I don't know. I've just never personally experienced anything like this, and I really don't know what to do about it. But thanks for listening, and hopefully soon I can figure this out. I've always been interested in the urban legend stuff. Creepy stories, monsters, and cryptids, pretty much whatever. I was born in Minnesota, but I've lived in Montana for pretty much all my life. Think Yellowstone country to the southwestern area. My family is super into the outdoors, camping, hiking, backpacking, hunting, fishing, etc. We're basically the poster child family for that sort of thing, if I'm being honest. We're the regulars in Yellowstone and Glacier, the whole Rocky Mountain area, in fact, and we frequently travel for our camping trips. If we go out of state, it's usually not very far though, like Idaho, Wyoming, or Colorado or something. And recently we've been pretty fond of the Island Park area in Idaho. I couldn't tell you why, probably for the fishing and the camping and the ATV access, but we're fairly new regarding that area, and we've only really been spending time down there for about 2 years now. So far, I have a lot of stories from Island Park that I can share another time. There's some weird stuff down there for sure. I don't really know if anything has ever happened there, or a lot about the history, so if anyone knows, please do share. But for those of you who have never heard of Island Park or have ever been there, here's a brief explanation. So in my opinion, it's one of the strangest places in the Northwest. So weird because it's home to a lot of landmarks and sites. It's called a city, but it's essentially just a long road. Think of the main road in a major town that runs through Targhee National Forest, and off this main road are several trails, roads, and accesses where you can find campgrounds and some other things. There are a few fairly large neighborhoods where you can rent out cabins too and such, but I don't know many people that live there full time. The ATV trails run everywhere as well. There's really no town area. Everything that's civilized is found off the main road, including a very good Mexican restaurant in fact, which I highly recommend to check out. So, you'll be on one side of the road for days at a time and not see another person or another gas station for miles. But don't get me wrong, it's a beautiful area with good fishing, and it's nice if you want to get away from everyone, but it's a sketchy area too for sure. There's nothing wrong with it, and I would recommend visiting it. The people there are pretty friendly, and it's a good atmosphere, but I just get an unsettling feeling there at times. For example, there are parts in the forest where every tree looks the same and it's just dead quiet, which really makes me shiver. It reminds me of that story or a joke a while back that Idaho isn't real and the government made it up. It makes me laugh every time because Island Park definitely gives off that vibe. But anyway, I'm getting carried away with my description. As I said, I have tons of stories about this place. So, my family and I were camping at Upper Coffee Pot, a campground pretty far back in the forest, right on the Henry's Fork, and it's a beautiful spot. Well, we were at the head of the campground, so right next to our spot is a trailhead and another spot adjacent to us. All the other camping spots are down the road, the opposite direction. This trail is really long as well, like it follows the riverbank the entire time, but it goes all the way up to Trout Hunters, a local spot for guides, up the road, 11 miles from the campground. And this trail connects to pretty much everything. Now, on this particular day, we were hanging around camp just fishing and being lazy, and around 3 o'clock, my dad and my sister and I decided to go for a hike up the trail, just for fun. We get all geared up and throw on our jackets and shoes. The trail is pretty well carved out. You could do it in flip-flops if you really wanted. But we didn't grab any bear spray. My dad grabbed a headlamp because, like I said, it's a heavily used area and we didn't plan on being out that long, but just in case. We head out and we're chatting and laughing, and I have no idea how far we made it. According to my dad, we were close to Trout Hunters. Looking back on it though, now that I've hung around the area a bit more, I don't think that was true. Eventually though, it does start to get dark and we end up turning around. Nothing out of the unusual had really happened, but still, everyone knows that you don't want to be out, miles from signs of people, with no bear spray and only one light at night time. It gets dark pretty quick here, and there's no moon at night, so we're trying to save the headlamp battery in case we really need it. We're going along the dark, watching the river and warning each other, hey, there's a stump right there and watch out for that dip. All of you who are avid hikers or have been outside at night know that time feels very different once it gets dark. Now, I'm not a wuss and I'm a pretty tough chick. Growing up as the oldest out of the 3 girls in my family with parents that raised us to be pretty badass, educated and outdoors enthusiasts. But I have my limits for sure, and I'm unfortunately the first one to get uneasy or worried about something, but on the opposite end of that, my feelings are usually right, so my family knows to listen to me when I say that something is about to go down. So naturally, for some reason, I start to get a bit antsy, and I start questioning my dad, asking how much further, did you bring matches, and blah blah blah. We have no idea what time it is or how long we've been out. None of us have had our watches on from fishing earlier, and like I said, time is pretty cruel in the dark. I try to distract myself though from every noise that I'm hearing by talking and focusing on the path I can barely see in front of me. I'm getting nervous because to my brain and internal clock, I think that there's no way that we should be still hiking. We should pretty much be back by now. My mind is running rampant about who knows what, and the more realistic dangers like bears and angry bull moose. My dad is also getting anxious and decides to turn the headlamp on to offer some security. We all know that there's only one way we're going to get back, and that's by walking, but none of us were particularly happy about the current situation, which involved no protection, which was our mistake, of course, for being lazy about our gear and undermining the time of the day, but still. But soon enough, we see lights from the campfires in the distance, but they're very faint. small specks of light, and we guess we have about 3 or more bends to go before we'll actually enter the vicinity of the camp. And right then was about the time when I got the feeling. I just instantly get these goosebumps and I shiver for a second. Then from behind us comes this scream. It's very distant, but trust me, anyone can recognize a scream. I've heard a lot of animal sounds in my life, and a lot of them are pretty whack, but this sounded like a rabbit scream. I don't know if you've ever heard a rabbit scream, but it's pretty terrifying. And I mean, truly, that sound should not come from a small animal like that. But anyway, we all stop in our tracks and are silent for a minute. Soon my dad turns to us and says that a coyote or something probably spooked the rabbit. I nod and I shiver again, and we continue, all a little bit on edge. About 30 paces ahead, and I stop again, and I just get this feeling of dread mixed with terror that shoots down my body. I'm just thinking, no way, and I don't know why, but I can't move. And it was probably because of what happens next. About maybe 20 yards back, I hear this strange cry. I can't really describe it very well because I honestly have never heard anything like it. It was kind of like a low whisper, like sort of a screech followed by a rustle and a faint laugh. And I know that it sounds silly, but when I say laugh, I don't mean like a chuckle or a joker's laugh. I mean more like a chant. Like two of the same words repeated in a rhythmic fashion. Note too that the sound is very faint and low, but for some reason I can still hear how close it is. At this point, I'm running to catch up with my sister and my dad, nearly pissing my pants. I was just noping the hell out of there because who knows what else is out there, and I'm pretty much scaring myself at this point instead of being rational, but I catch up to them and my sister is pale. I ask her if they heard a sound, and she goes, "You mean the rustle followed by the growl?" "Yeah." My dad looks at me and motions for us to keep going. I ask him if he's ever heard anything like that before, and he says that it's probably the same thing that we heard before. I kind of got the sense that he was lying, but I didn't say anything because he was acting calm, and it helped me to calm down as well. We continue around the next bend, though, for a while, and suddenly we all freeze because there's this rustle a couple of feet in front of us. My dad turns the headlamp off, and we all stand still holding our breath. If it's a bull moose, you don't want to catch him by surprise, so we're all just kind of standing there waiting it out. After a minute and no other sound, we slowly continue on. My dad is shining the headlamp on the ground and he comes to a sudden halt. My sister and I want to know what's going on, so we go to take a look, and on the ground, footprints. My dad gave a motion for us to be quiet, and we slowly followed them. They started out as sort of spread out, long, almost human-shaped, or maybe a small bear or a big back foot of a rabbit or something. But not one of us is paying attention to where we were anymore. We're just looking at these footprints. But my dad looks up, and we're about 10 feet from the opening of the trailhead, about 20 feet from our campsite, and we can see my mother and my other sister just sitting by the fire. Obviously, we're all pretty relieved to see that, to almost be back, so we're just kind of joking around and continuing to look at the footprints. We don't really want some hobo following us to the camp or whatever they belong to. The prints got smaller and more closely spaced, and my dad said that was really strange. This is where the story just starts to get really whack. So, the print started to resemble that of a deer or a small elk, and we were all really confused. My dad suggested that maybe the deer or the elk came from the water, which caused the marks to look bigger and longer earlier in the trail. But how could they start by looking human or bear-like and turn into deer hooves like that? But that wasn't even the strangest part. The longer we stood there, the more the information kind of flooded in, and the prints were one set of deer hooves, so unless we missed something, deer have always had 4 legs, right? Soon the print stopped, just kind of stopped about 5 feet from the trailhead and just vanished as well. My dad scanned the area. The footprints didn't go off into the trees anywhere. They didn't turn around, and it was like whatever made them just kind of disappeared at that point. My sister laughed and kind of shrugged it off, saying that maybe the two-legged deer could fly. I started to feel sick to my stomach, though, and I think the mix of the dark, the weird sounds, and the impossible footprints just finally got to me. I ran back to camp, and I promptly puked in some of the shrubs close by. I got to bed that night just fine, but I definitely was not okay with what we had found earlier that night. I knew that I was safe, but a part of me knew that something just wasn't right about those tracks and those noises. And my dad woke me up the next morning and told me that our dear friend visited last night. I jumped out of bed and went to have a look, and sure enough, there were a couple of deer tracks around our trailer. For the rest of the time that we were there, we didn't see any more two-legged deer prints or human prints, and we also didn't hear any more noises, thank God. I still think about those tracks disappearing, though, and somehow just kind of changing into another like that. And that god-awful sound as well. I still tell myself that it was just wet deer tracks, but I really can't fully convince myself. If anyone has any questions, then please do ask, and if anyone knows what could have happened that night, or has any sort of explanation about what followed us that night, please also let me know, because I'm very curious. If you would like to hear more about my other experiences in Island Park, I would be glad to share those too, so please let me know. I haven't really told anybody about this story because, well, I didn't want to freak out any of my friends. So I've limited it to just my mum and a few close friends, but I guess now you'll know too. So, how my friend group works is we have our own little circle of people that we hang around with most often, but for big events or bonfires or something similar, we expand and a couple of different friend groups join us. Ben is a part of one of those extended friend groups, and he's someone who always posts different and interesting things, who always has something to say, really. I've gotten along really well with Ben at these events, and we always end up chatting. I've always found him to be different and a bit of a unique individual. And Ben started going to my local college this year. He shot me a Snapchat basically saying, "Hey, all my friends went away to different schools, and the only person I have to talk to from this area is now my ex-girlfriend. I was wondering if you wanted to get a group together and hang out because I'd like to have some new friends around." It was actually a really nice message because with the course that I was in, I don't get to make many friends, and all my close friends are spread out now too, so I said yes. The hangout was initially supposed to be one of my friends, him and one of his friends. It was a day after class and I just got home. He told me that he was going to take a quick nap before we all head out. When he wakes up though, he tells me that it's now too late and he has other plans that he forgot about, which was totally fine. I mean, I wasn't too upset about it. I cancelled with my other friend too, so I can just sit down and do some homework. But he texted me a few hours later. I didn't give him my number, he must have found out, telling me that his other plans got cancelled and he's now available again and wondering if I still wanted to do something. I said that my friend was now out of the city, and he said that he texted his friend, but they didn't answer. He decided to pick me up and go for a drive and just chat. Normal enough, right? Ben gets to my house at around 10, and I go and hop into his car, and he speeds off. Oddly enough, though, he's talking in an accented voice, kind of like a Jamaican or something similar. I thought that he was just being goofy, so I played along. Sometimes I would answer back in the accent, but then I started to think that it was weird that he wasn't talking in his own voice at all. He was driving like a maniac down the street as well, telling me how he was drinking earlier because he thought that he was going to a party. I asked him if he was drinking and driving, and he said no, he only had a few sips. I know I probably should have just gotten out of the car then, but at this point, we're flying down the highway and I'm actually pretty scared. He begins to rant about his ex now, telling me that there was infidelity and trust issues on his end, and he couldn't tell me what they were because he didn't want me to think badly of him. He told me that he was still going to marry this girl and have her children. He ranted about her and got on tangents and started to scream and yell at one point. I started to think that maybe he was on drugs or something. We arrive at the college, though, a half hour to a 45-minute drive away in another city. and he says that, well, we should get out of the car. I'm already pretty scared, and my phone is dying now, so I just listen to what he says. I was honestly literally thinking that he might kill me as well. He took me for a walk through the light woods and then started to make sounds like a weird creature. He would make like dinosaur sounds or sounds like The Grudge or something. He would also walk like a creature, morphing his body into this weird, creepy movement. I requested for us to go home because I was obviously terrified. We got back into the car and we started driving home. He pulls out a pipe and smokes something, and I told him that he shouldn't do that, but he just didn't listen. And now he begins to yell. He starts going back on his tangents about life again. He pulls over the car to get out and do some jumping kicks or something. At this point, my phone is actually dead. He gets back into the car and puts on his favourite song. This song begins slow and then picks up a little later. It's like a 4-minute song, and he begins to scream along to the lyrics and smashes the window on the dashboard and the wheel with his hands, stomping his feet as well. And I've seen someone passionate about a song before, but this was on another level. Ben swerves all around the road until we get to my house. He then turns to me and says, without an accent, "I know it's late, but do you want to have sex?" in the most just casual tone in the world. I gave a nervous laugh and I said, "Actually, I'm good." He turned to the back seat to get something, but I got out of the car and I just booked it to my house. I locked the door to my house and the bedroom door in my room as if he would break in, and it might not sound as terrifying as it was for me in that moment, but at the time, I was just shaking out of pure fear. I don't know if he was on some sort of a crazy drug or if he had some sort of a split personality or what, but I've never met a person before who I've honestly looked at and thought to myself, you are going to kill someone someday. I really hope that he doesn't hear this because I actually see him at school pretty frequently. But yeah, fun life, right? So, I have a lot of stories that have happened to me throughout my life. I don't know what it is about me, but I seem to attract paranormal stuff. But I wanted to tell this one since it kind of relates to the season. So last year, we got some snow around this time of year. It was pretty, but it's New York, so it's usually gorgeous here in the winter anyway. And well, I woke up one morning, did my morning routine, and went outside to check the mail when I noticed footprints in the snow that didn't belong to me or my husband. And they were far too large, extremely large in fact. The person who made them would have had to have been well over 6 feet tall, and I'm around 5'11", and my husband is actually shorter than me. They started at the road and came up to our kitchen window. It looked like someone had just kind of stopped to peek in the window or something. They continued around the side, then to the back of the house, and when they looped around and went into the neighbour's yard, I followed them. And they went straight through my neighbour's backyard, into the field that spans off into the woods behind our house, and then they just stopped. Right in the middle of the field. They just vanished. We called the cops, and a police officer came around to take a look at them. He seemed a bit rattled and confused by it. He didn't really have an explanation as to why they just stopped in the middle of a field. I mean, it had snowed a few days prior, and we hadn't gotten any more snow since then, so it wasn't as if fresh snow had just covered them. Otherwise, it would have covered the other tracks as well. The officer asked around about our neighbour too, but she's an old woman in hospice care, so she couldn't have made the tracks herself. The reason why I'm posting this here is because I'm 100% certain that these tracks, they weren't made by a person. I don't know what they were made by, but I do know that seeing them stop dead in the middle of the field like that made me feel sick to my stomach. I still think about them quite often when it snows, and I dread the day that I'm going to see them again. The other really peculiar thing about this to me, though, is that I also have dogs. In particular, I have 2 very vocal dogs who bark if they so much as hear a scratch on the wall or see something outside. And that night, they didn't make a sound. I should also say that I think our house is actually haunted. After doing some research into the property, I found that the last owner died in the house due to complications of lung cancer. But we have occasionally heard rasping and heavy breathing in the house, and I've personally seen apparitions, strange lights, and my husband has been physically hurt as well. We had the house blessed last year, and things seem to have calmed down quite a bit after that. I don't know if the footprints in the snow were related to this or not, but it remains an intensely disturbing experience for me. Because if it wasn't paranormal, then who the hell was out there? So there's this hotel at the Bulgarian seaside in which we have an apartment. To be honest, that's a strong word for it, because it's just a big room with a giant bed, really, a refrigerator, big windows on both of the walls, and a small bathroom. It's on a ground floor, and again, both of the walls are facing the parking lot of the hotel. Despite all of it, though, it's perfect for me alone. It's right by the beach, and that's why I've been spending some of my summer vacations there. So, July 3 years ago, I'm spending a week with my ex-boyfriend there, and 3 or 4 weeks alone after that. My ex always said that the owners of the hotel are a bunch of creeps, because whenever we went out of the room, we had to walk a path passing through the reception, where they used to sit all day, basically doing nothing. The old dad, maybe 60, his son Crumb, maybe 40, and his daughter, roughly 45, and her husband. And when you pass them, they all just would get silent and just kind of stare at you, pretty much every single time as well. I was used to it already, but the boyfriend was really irritated, especially when he caught Crumb staring at my ass, just smiling. After that, he used to stare him down deadly, right in the eye, whenever he got the chance. So, my ex goes back to the city, and it's now the 3rd week that I've been alone, and the night is really hot, so I open both windows wide open, and put the curtains above them, to protect myself from being peeked at. After all, I am on the ground level, and my bed is right below both of the windows. I wake up in the middle of the night, and I feel like someone's watching me. This happens the next few nights too. I'm easily scared though, and a little bit paranoid. I was also alone there, so I was just telling myself to chill and that it's just my crazy mind trying to scare itself. Some nights went by without any problems as well. Meanwhile, Crumb was trying to talk to me about 2 or 3 times when I was trying to go off to the beach. It's around 1 a.m. I'm falling asleep and I hear footsteps outside the path. That's not too strange because there are some people next to me staying at the same kind of apartment. Maybe someone's just coming home or going out partying or something. But the steps stop at one point, really close outside. I hear all of it because of the open windows, and I'm sitting in the bed now and listening when I notice that the freaking door handle is moving slowly up and down. I kind of lost my crap, but I gave myself a nice job girl pat on the back for locking the door. And after that, nothing happened, and the same person just walked away. I closed the windows, called my dad, and told him what had just happened. He told me to lock and close everything and that he'll take me in the morning. It's a 5-hour drive. This was all 3 years ago, but last night, we're having dinner, and my dad is like, "Do you remember your sea adventures?" And proceeds to tell me that he had made his own little investigation back in the day and asked the owners of the hotel for security camera records. And they checked the ones at the parking lot and see a male figure walking around. The part with the door handle wasn't in the camera range though, but my dad remembers a strange midnight waking up routine and tells them to check older records, in which you'll see a man at my window peeking through the curtains, standing there for like 15 or 20 minutes. The woman finally recognized her brother and told my dad that he has mental disabilities and begged him not to press any charges, and that they'll take better care of him and look after him. So, good guy Dad didn't press any charges, and it appears that we're selling the apartment now. So, anyone interested in buying? This was about 3 years ago in Big Bend National Park. My friend, my husband and I were all going on a trip to do some primitive camping. I'm not a hardcore camper, but I've done my share of primitive camping and hiking and whatnot, so I like to think that I have some wilderness sense. I know what common animals are like, having grown up in 8 acres of forest land. Coyotes were frequent visitors, so I know how creepy that they can sound. That's why I know that what we encountered that night definitely was something else. So we arrived at Big Bend around 4 p.m, checked in and set up our tent at our campsite, 9 Point Draw. It's a pretty desolate location around the entrance to the park. The campsite is about 25 miles to the visitor center and lodge, and about 40 miles from the Rio Grande village. And so we were definitely not near any kind of civilization that I know of. But we had the idea that we would go for a night, hike to a nearby trail, after having dinner that night. And so in preparation, I decided to scout out the trail from our campsite. The terrain in this part of the camp is totally flat desert with some ground vegetation, so we thought it would be an easy route for our campsite to the trail. The trek from our campsite was not difficult, but as an added precaution, I put a few rock piles up so as to follow that night. After dinner, we decided to head out at around 10 p.m. The first 10 minutes were pretty uneventful. We were all in good spirits when suddenly we hear a scuttling noise from about 50 feet behind us. Having been used to animal noises at night, we wrote it off as just a critter. A few minutes later, though, we heard the same noise a bit closer and sounding like a much bigger animal. There are black bears here, but we weren't in the area that they were normally sighted. Like I said, the landscape was wide open and we didn't see anything with our flashlights. We were a bit uneasy, but willing to go on. The rock piles had been doing a good job of leading in the right direction. And all at once, I just stopped because I just felt absolute terror. It truly was an indescribable feeling. I see many other people in this sub reference it, but I just knew that we were in danger, and I didn't know why. I looked to my friend and my husband, who both looked as terrified as I felt, and there was no sound, no wind. But then in an instant, the most inhuman scream erupted, seemingly all around us. We all froze for what felt like minutes, but I'm sure was just seconds. I don't remember making the decision to run back, but the next thing that I do remember is that we were all running. We had made it pretty far out at this point. Even though I thought that I was running in the direction of our camp, I remember scanning for the rock piles that I'd made, but not being able to find any, and almost turning back thinking that we were headed in the wrong direction. But I had this instinct that I was definitely not going to do that. We made it to a rather large rock that I knew was on the route back to the campsite. I also remember putting a rock pile beside that rock, and I went to check if it was there to make sure that we were headed to our campsite. And the rocks were still there, but they'd been knocked over. This set off all the alarms, and I told my friend and my husband that we had to get back to the camp as soon as possible. We made it back a few minutes later, thankfully. By the time that we got back, though, I was entirely freaked out, and I didn't want to stay. I think my husband was as well, but my friend convinced us that it must have just been the wildlife. So we just stayed that night in the tent. I don't know if it was connected, but there were scuttling and footsteps around the tent just all night as well. And either way, I didn't sleep. We didn't do any more primitive hiking that trip, and we opted instead for a campsite in one of the community camps. But let me finish by saying this. I have never felt that feeling before or since, and I've been in the woods at night plenty of times. And the next day, I went out to check if all the rock piles had been knocked down. And they had. I don't think any animal would deliberately go around knocking over the markers, right? I mean, that's what really makes me think that whatever this was, it was sentient. I don't know what it was, but I'm glad that we made it out. So I live and work on a farm in southwest Victoria, Australia. And one of my jobs or hobbies is going hunting for deer to eat and some kangaroos to control their population as they breed incredibly quickly. A few years ago in spring, I was wandering along the boundary of our smaller farm, the one that my granddad or nonno in Italian cleared for farming, and the bush or forest when I saw a path leading into the dense underbrush. I climbed over the rickety old barbed wire perimeter fence and headed down into a particular thick part of the bush that I knew I hadn't explored thoroughly before. But when hunting, our local species of deer, mostly sambar, but we also see hog and red deer and whatnot, it's best to move in stops and starts so you fit in with the general bush noises and sound more like a prey animal rather than a predator on the prowl. Here I was taking 5 steps, stopping to look around me and then taking another 5 steps and so on, when I noticed that my last 5 steps were unusually loud, or rather, everything else had just kind of gone quiet. There were no cows bellowing in the distance, no wind in the gum trees, or the sound of screeching cockatoos passing overhead, just dead silence. It was at this point, too, that the hair all over my body stood up. I unslung my rifle from my shoulder and I cocked it, thinking that maybe I was being stalked by wild dogs. I was wrong though, because as I looked around, my existential dread mounted, and when I saw him, I thought that I was about to pass out. He was off to my left and was kind of a blurry caricature of an old man wearing a red hat, and pretty much no other distinctive features. It was hard to see him clearly because it was kind of like looking through a heat haze, but I knew that he could see me just fine, as the dark spots that he had for eyes were pretty much locked with mine. Standing about 20 meters to the left of the path among the ferns and the underbrush, I could not see his hands either. That is, until they lifted into view, holding an axe. And that was quite unlike the man thing that I was seeing, very much solid and clear in view. That movement snapped me out of my shock, and although I was terrified and didn't know what the hell I was looking at, I raised my gun to my shoulder and pointed it at him and started to back along the path cautiously. I passed a tree which hid him from view for the tiniest moment, and within that second, he was gone, and the sound instantly came back. But with no warning, I could hear all the usual sounds and see clearly all around me. I was still terrified and pretty much sprinted out of the bush after that. Admittedly, a roo jumped out of the brush not far from the trail, and I popped off a shot out of just sheer fright, missing it. I got to the edge of the paddock again and legged it to my ute, sped home, and pretty much just slept with my gun under my bed that night. Nothing like that has ever really happened to me before, although I have had some weird encounters in the bush for sure. In the same area, there has always been rumours of weird things happening among the farmers and the locals, including some stories like my own, although differing in the details. I don't know what happened or what I really saw, but it shook my view of reality and changed me as it gradually sank in that it was some kind of paranormal activity stuff, and not just someone playing a joke. I didn't talk to people about it immediately, but have since, and my uncle was shocked when I told him and explained to me that a similar experience happened to him as a kid in the mountains near Mount Hotham in a little town called Bright that hosted a satanic cult. But that's a whole nother story for another time. If you made it this far, thanks for listening. I appreciate it. And stay safe out there, whether you're in the forest or the bush. So I was on a semester-long backpacking trip with NOLS. If you've never heard of them before, it's basically an outdoor leadership school. This particular semester was full of climbing, whitewater rafting, backpacking and canoeing and stuff. In total, it was around 90 days of sleeping in the wilderness, I think. We shared tents, but most nights I opted to sleep under the stars, about 50 or 100 feet away from the group. Even a little snoring will keep me up at night, so I was always far enough away where I couldn't hear much. Now, if you know anything about Grand Gulch, it's rich with history, with ruins around just about every corner. It's hard for the average person to get a permit to backpack through this area, but it's hard for the average person to get a permit to backpack through this area. We spent a total of 29 days in this area, only running into one other group at one time, so it's fairly remote. And this particular night was pretty much like any other. I scoped out a perfectly flat spot on some slick rock, and I kicked away some of the rocks to clear the area. I set up my sleeping pad, and I pretty much fell asleep right away. My watch had an alarm for 6 a.m. to wake me up and start for the day, but for whatever reason I slept through my alarm and my friend walked over to wake me up. As he walked up to me, instead of saying wake up, he said to me, "Whoa, did you find this last night?" Because laying right next to my head was a perfectly carved arrowhead. I mean, perfect. No more than a foot from my head as well. It was about 6 inches long, by far the biggest one I've ever seen. I know for a fact that it wasn't there when I set up my sleeping pad. I had definitely cleared the area before I set up my pad, which means that there's no way that I would have missed this thing. I explained that I'd never seen it, and I was surprised that I missed it. I was kind of dumbfounded, but at this point, he realized that I didn't find it and said, "I'm going to keep it." He picked it up and promptly dropped it, breaking it into 2 pieces. We left the broken arrowhead there, and all I know is that that arrowhead was not there when I set up my camp. But I will always wonder just who placed that next to my head that night, and why. So this story was told to me by my cousin. We were swapping spooky stories at my uncle's cabin when he told me this one. So he and 2 friends decided to take off for the weekend and go camping. They grabbed their gear, food, and camper van and drove out to the mountain range. They checked the forecast beforehand and it said sunny with no precipitation for the duration of the weekend. It's mid-July. As they're setting up camp, Dave says that he's going to eat some magic mushrooms and go for a vision quest. The other 2 laugh it off and tell him to be careful and not to wander off too far. A few hours pass and Dave has yet to return, and as it's starting to get dark, he emerges from the bushes with a puzzled look on his face. He explained that his trip was going just fine until he turned around and realized that he lost the track of the path. He stumbled around the forest for what seemed like forever, in a thought loop, and it wasn't until he stumbled and fell that he realized that he was going in the opposite direction of the camp. He turned around and doubled back, and then he arrived. Now, as evening sets in and the crew is getting ready to call it a night, it starts to snow. Then it starts to really snow, blizzard even, and they pack up everything in the van and decide to leave the next day. Around 1 or 2 in the morning, Jake, my cousin, wakes up covered in goosebumps. He climbs out of his bed and wanders around the van, first checking to make sure it's still locked, and it is. He turns around and tries to look out the window. It's completely frosted over. As he's trying to make out anything at all, a feeling comes over him like there's someone or something looking directly back at him from outside. In the end, he just kind of dismisses it and he goes back to bed. The next morning, they awaken to snow still coming down. Jake, still thinking about last night, walks around to the window that he felt uneasy at, and to his horror, there are bipedal tracks leading up to the van window, but none leading away. He runs and tells his friends, and they agree that it's time to get out of there ASAP. They get to the nearest gas station, still very remote, and their van breaks down, and as they're trying to figure out what to do, this fella drives up to the pumps and says, "We haven't seen weather like this for 20 years. You boys be careful out there. Something just doesn't feel right." And then he just drives away. Out of nowhere, this large, dark red van pulls up directly in front of them, and the driver gruffly says, "Hurry up, get in, I'll take you to the nearest town." With a little hesitation at first, they eventually get inside, and as they drive, he's going faster and faster until they reach speeds that are definitely not recommended for winter, and they're sure that they're about to die, ghost white, speechless, and they just ride. He gets them to the nearest town, opens the door and says, "Hurry up, get out." They oblige, and before they can even thank him, he pulls a U-turn and just drives back the same direction that they came. And they later found out that the first man that they talked to at the gas station drove for a couple of kilometers, only to meet his demise via a head-on collision. It truly is just a crazy world that we live in. I found this story interesting because it comes from a very honest person too. I really don't think that he would have exaggerated the details, but Let me know what you think. Do you believe that there was something pulling their strings? I'm also really intrigued by the guy who actually drove them out of there. Really mysterious, right? Oh, and by the way, this would have been somewhere near Jasper National Park in Canada, if anyone's interested. So this goes back about 17 years now, I think. But it just keeps popping up in my head lately, and I want to share it. I haven't told many people about this, and it's never really been spoken about. So, I was about 14 when I went on a holiday with my horrible dad, and my wicked stepmother, and my two stepsisters. Stepsister 1 and I were 2 months apart in age, while stepsister 2 is around 12. So we all went down the road from our hotel to a bar, and the rule there was if you could hold a glass, then you could drink. We were typical teenagers, so it was unusual for us to be allowed a few, but anyway, my horrible dad and my wicked stepmother decided that it was time to call it a night. My stepsisters and I were having a good time. We felt really grown up and didn't want to retire for the night, but we struck a deal with our parents that we could stay until 11 and then come straight back to the hotel, and meet our parents in the hotel bar where they would wait for our safe return. We had fun, and it was getting close to midnight, so we decided to make a short walk back to the hotel. We didn't want to be late, and if we did as we were told, we might be allowed to do it again. So we start walking back all together. The hotel was on top of this steep, winding, hilly road. As we were walking up this road, a car drove past and continued up the hill. Nothing to worry about because it was just a car. However, a red flag went up when it came back down the hill quite slowly. But again, maybe they were just lost or something. But we got a bit more of a brisk walk on us, and the same car was then driving up behind us, slowly. I felt really uneasy, and I shouted "run" to my sisters. But by the time that I shouted this, they were right by our sides, and I shouted at stepsister 2, the youngest, to run back and get the parents, because they had grabbed stepsister 1 and tried dragging her in the car. I ran back down to the car screaming, and I grabbed stepsister 1, and we had a tug-of-war with her. I kicked the man in the shin, and finally, he let go. At this point, we just legged it, and our parents had started running towards us as well, and the car sped away. I don't really often tell this story because mostly people just think that I'm lying. And honestly, it took me many years to think back on it, in fact, and go, whoa, that was messed up. But anyways, this was about 8 years ago, so I would have been 10 or 11, and I lived outside of Dallas, Texas. My single mum was pretty much in her own world, so I often just ran around our crappy apartment complex and did whatever I wanted, mostly with my best friend, Sarah. Now, one day we bumped into 2 boys who may have been 2 or so years older than us. I don't really remember what they looked like, or even our initial interaction with them, but they ended up luring us to a shed in the back of the apartment complex. They must have claimed that they wanted to show me something, and I was naive enough to go into the shed with them. Sarah, however, must have been more aware of the situation than I was, because she just kind of hung around outside of the shed. Once inside, they pretty much blocked the shed doors, and then they tied my hands together. Now, I know it sounds stupid, but at 10 years old, I had no idea what was going on. I grew up with a very conservative Mormon grandmother, and she would never dare taint my mind with such dark ideas, even if it meant warning me about predators. I guess I must have just thought as the whole thing is a game. I finally started to catch on, though, once they started telling me that they wanted me to take my shirt off, and they were trying to threaten me into doing so. I was pretty lucky that my friend Sarah was hanging around outside, because I started calling for her and asking her to go and get her mum. The boys panicked at that point, and they let me go. Everything turned out alright, and I'm not sure what would have happened to me, but the whole thing creeps me out now. I never did tell my mum about it. I guess I never fully understand what actually happened, and it didn't seem like a big deal to me at the time. I didn't even think about it for a long time after that, until one day it just kind of hit me like, what the hell? Anyways, I was lucky that my friend Sarah was there for me, because if she hadn't have been, it could have been a very different story. So I've been a stay-at-home mum since 2012. This fall, my youngest started kindergarten and I have 2 girls. So it was mid-morning, both my girls are at school, and I'm laying on my bed just reading a book. I can see through my open door through the living room to the hallway that leads to the girls' room, their bathroom and their playroom as well, and I hear a noise and look up to see a middle-aged white male with blue gloves, like your bugman would wear, walk into my garage door. I freeze, not knowing what to do. I know my bugman, and this is definitely not him, and the guy didn't knock. He immediately heads down the hallway that is just my children's rooms. I call my husband. I have no idea why I didn't call 911, but my husband calls the police and his brother who lives 2 minutes away. He must have gone into the playroom because maybe a minute has gone by. I'm going for a weapon and I hear my dog start to growl. She sleeps under my girl's bed during the day, and so I yell, "Here, Belle!" And the man comes out of the right where the garage door is at the front of the hallway, and my lab Belle runs to me in the room. He stutters out, no one is supposed to be home, and I say that my husband is on the way, and he mutters something as he exits the garage. Obviously, I'm totally freaking out, but I get up and all the things that I grab, I get a tiger stick that my brother-in-law brought home for a missionary trip to Africa and run out after this dude. There's no car and he's gone, and my brother-in-law and the police pull up at the same time, not a minute after this guy exited. I told them that I was fine and that maybe he was a bugman who got the wrong house or something. The police didn't pass a bugman vehicle on the way into the neighborhood though. We have only one entrance to the neighborhood too, and that's when it hit me. The gloves that he was wearing, they were the blue dental gloves that my husband brings home from his office for me to clean with. They sit on a table right beside the garage door before you walk in, and I ran back and checked my girls' room and then to the back playroom, and the playroom window had been unlocked on both sides. I knew it was the man too because it had been extremely hot weather for weeks and I kept all the windows shut, locked, and even the blinds closed. And the blinds were all open as well, which means that he came in my daughter's bedrooms. About 2 years ago, I used to work part-time at a popular pizza chain as a delivery driver. I had a full-time job during the day, so the shift at the pizza place would be from 6 p.m. to 12 p.m. I enjoyed the job for the fact that I made pretty good money and it was easy. But I hated working at night because it was pretty sketchy. So one night, we got a call 30 minutes before closing for a delivery in the worst part of town. I was stuck taking the order since my manager sent the other driver home early because it was a bit of a slow night. So I hurriedly headed out to deliver this pizza. About 20 minutes later, my GPS said that I had arrived. I couldn't really read the house number as it was pitch dark and none of the houses had their porch lights on or anything. As safety, I called the customer to ask if they could turn on their light. He didn't answer until the 6th ring. He tells me that his house has the 2 trash bins next to the curb and that the light is broken, so he couldn't turn it on. I start walking through the front yard to the front door when I see a man staring at me through a window. I yell out hello to him, but there's no reaction. He doesn't even move to open the door. I'm getting goosebumps now, and I just decide to turn around and go back to my car. I call the customer again to come and get his pizza from my car, and he tells me in a really slow and creepy voice to ignore his roommate. He said that the door was unlocked, and if I could take the pizza to the basement, because he rents the bottom floor apparently. As I'm on the phone, I could also make out a small light from the window, and it was at this point that I noticed that the man that was staring at me earlier was the one that was on the phone talking to me. I just hung up and I took off. By the time that I got back to the restaurant, the phones were turned over and any complaints would have to wait until the next day. But I'm telling you right now that I'm not delivering to any basements and I'll be taking your pizza home for dinner. Back When I was in 6th grade, I had a friend who owned a Ouija board, and we had never really hung out. I practically begged her to let us play, but instead, my dad bought one. Everyone in my family freaked out besides me and my dad. I was stoked and excited to try it. We had to attend a dinner in about an hour, so we decided to play around just to see what would happen. And this is where I made my first mistake, with my second mistake asking is there anyone there to communicate with when we started. Supposedly, and now that I know, that opens the door to practically anything. It could be a demon, a spirit, or anything. Preferably you should ask for a specific person to prevent things like this happening. And the person that we spoke to went by the name of Dee Dee, and was apparently strangled to death by her own father at the age of 35. We ended the game later because we had to leave, and that's all I really remember asking. And the entire time, the only people that were saying that I was moving it were my two sisters, because my dad and I both kept insisting that neither of us were moving the planchette. Later that night, though, we got home, and I just got a really strange feeling. When it was time to go to sleep, I kept the light on, and I couldn't sleep that night. I lived in a big city in Texas at the time, and that was the last time that I actually played it until I moved. About a half a year later, though, we moved to a smaller town in Texas, and something gave me the urge to play the Ouija board again. My sister and I played, and the candle blew out, and it had said that it wanted to keep my sister forever, or something along those lines, and she started screaming and crying at this. We ended the game, obviously, and I hadn't played for about a month after that. We played with a family friend, and we spoke to a younger girl who had overdosed, and still at the time, everyone who hadn't played had believed that we were moving it. We played one last time, though, with my mum and I, since I played every time, and we tried to talk to her dead grandma. My mum said, if it is her, then spell out her middle name, which I had not known. The board kept spelling out the first two letters, but had never spelt out the entire name. Before we ended the conversation, the board kept spelling out Lil Peep and Gustav, which I absolutely love Peep, and we kept asking questions and receiving responses I didn't know the answers to. At the bottom of the board, there's a woman with a spirit behind her, and the planchette continuously moved there. I never knew what that meant until we did the Ouija board, and I was kind of freaked out knowing that a spirit was right behind me. And at one point, the board kept going to O and Z. I'll never say the name again, though, because it creeps me out. And so we ended the game. Right when we said goodbye, though, I just started crying hysterically, and I couldn't help it. And this is the point when things got really weird. At night, we would hear scratches and whispers, and at first my parents called BS and thought that my two sisters were making it up. At one point, my sister said that she heard footsteps behind her and thought that someone was chasing her, but nobody was there. My dad's friend was a ghost hunter, or a specialist, if you can call them that, and we had him interview my siblings. He kept getting eerie vibes from my sister's room, and at first he didn't believe us. He decided that he would conduct an investigation, though, and it started with recording the room audio at night, and he would catch whispers and noises and stuff like that, and we could never exactly decipher what was being said, but you could definitely hear something. Now, there was an overnight stay, which was the last part of the investigation. My dad's friend, and his wife stayed at our house from, I believe, 11 or 12 to about 3 or 4 in the morning. Me and my siblings and my mum stayed in a hotel that night while they stayed at the house, and I have honestly never seen my dad so scared in my entire life. I don't really feel like explaining every portion because it's not really necessary, but here's the more interesting parts. So at one point, they pulled out a spirit box. My dad was new to all of this, and the minute that they took it out, the spirit box said my dad's friends' names out loud. My dad got freaked out by this. It then continued to mock my dad and them and started to swear. It sounded like multiple people talking, apparently. At the time, we had beanbags in our house, so the beanbags were constantly getting stepped on, and so was the piano that we had in the house too. Near the end of it all, though, all of the cameras just drained, and my dad was already freaked out when, all of a sudden, a twistable light just twisted on by itself. My dad still talks about that moment sometimes, and my dad then called my mum every 5 seconds because he was terrified. After all of this, I haven't seen that Ouija board since, and our house was cleansed. I think the board is locked up somewhere, which I'll never know where, but I'm glad that it's gone, to be honest. I know a lot of people will never believe this story, and that's okay. I know people with similar experiences, and they understand what it's like. All I would advise is don't use a Ouija board, because I can assure you that it's most definitely not a toy. So the other night, I was driving in the center lane of a 3-lane city street. And all of a sudden, a car comes into my right blind spot and almost slams into me. I look over and it's swerving in and out of lanes, braking abruptly. I honk and I look over to see if the driver is possibly distracted. And I see that the man is driving and drinking something out of a brown bottle. The man then comes up to my side and is screaming at the top of his lungs. Not wanting to get involved, though, I then make a lane change to the leftmost lane to get away from this guy. I can still hear him screaming, so I turn on my rearview camera and I see the man swerve across 2 lanes from rightmost lane to get behind me. He then starts speeding up as if he's trying to ram into me from behind. And once I see him just inches from my bumper, I decide to run the red light I'm stopped at and make a right turn in front of the 2 lanes of traffic beside me in the hopes that at this point he'll just leave me alone. I look at my rearview camera once again and I see that this man is following me, trying to hit me from behind yet again. I panic and I speed off on a side street, but I look back and he just won't let up. He's swerving in lanes behind me and is desperately trying to keep up with me. In the distance, I see a freeway on-ramp, so I speed over in the hope of losing him on the freeway. The on-ramp has 2 lanes that merge into one. I pass up a car prior to the merge, thinking that car will create a buffer between me and the man chasing me. When I look back into my camera, though, I see that the man is driving in the shoulder, on the brush, to the side of the on-ramp in order to pass the other car and catch up to me. It was at this point that I'm driving close to 100 miles per hour, scared for my life, so I slow down and I dial 911. I explain the situation to the dispatcher and she recommends that I try to get away to safety and whatnot. The man then catches up to me and begins coming up to the side of me on the freeway. He repeatedly tries to swerve into me as if to ram me or run me off the road. I slow down in the hopes that he'll just pass me up, but he slows down too, and then I notice that his wife in the passenger seat throws a bottle at my car as well. For a second, I lose visibility, as the car is covered in a brown foamy fluid. I think to myself, surely this is the extent of this road rage, and I look over and it seems as if he's continuing on the freeway. Ready to get away, I then pull off onto the next freeway exit thinking that I can just leave this situation. As I do this, the man sees me and makes a 4-lane change onto the exit ramp and tries to ram me once again at the freeway exit. I then am forced to speed through the city streets and I finally end up at a red light trapped next to this guy. I look over at the man and I roll down my window. He's screaming at me all sorts of obscenities. His wife is also yelling at me, saying stuff, and I look into the back seat and I see 2 children in car seats. Since I'm on speaker with the dispatcher, she hears all of this and tells me to just try and get away. And at this point, I am very much done. I just want to get away from him, so I make a U-turn to head back on the freeway. But he follows me once again and almost hits a plastic construction lane barrier to do so. He then follows me again and is trying to hit me from behind once more. Once I get on the overpass to get on the freeway, I glance at him to the side of me and I see that he's holding something in my direction. Suddenly, I hear a very loud bang, and in that moment, the dispatcher on the phone screams, "Did he shoot at you? Are you okay?" Thinking that I've been shot at, I start screaming, "He's shooting at me, he's shooting at me, he's going to kill me." Realizing that running away isn't working, I stop and the man speeds off. Luckily, there's no broken glass and I'm not injured in any way. The dispatcher tells me to pull off to a nearby safe location, so I go to the parking lot of a nearby mall. I tell the dispatcher the make, colour and the model of the car as well as a partial license plate. Obviously, the whole time that I'm driving there, I'm concerned that this guy is following me again. but they sent an officer over immediately to file a police report. In waiting for the officer, I realized that my car's camera was also recording this, so I hit the save button. The officer comes over and I tell him my story, describing everything in detail. I also tell him that I may also have footage of the whole thing, and we take a walk around my car, and for the most part there seems to be no damage. The officer then informs me that because I'm not injured and because there's no damage to the car, that there really isn't anything that they can do. I ask him if it was an assault, and he says because the bottle hit my car and not me, technically it's not assault. I ask him if it's reckless driving, and he says that here in CA, that's a misdemeanor, and that requires the presence of a CHP officer to convict it. I then ask him if it could be considered an attempted murder because he was trying to ram into me, but he says that this is just plain old road rage and there's not much that can be done about it. At most, the officer says that once he has a complete license plate, an officer can go out and talk to the guy. I ask if the potential footage could be helpful in getting this man reprimanded in some way, and he tells me to only send me the highlights and necessary screenshots, though he doesn't think anything can be done. At the end of all of this, though, I am extremely shaken up by it. I eventually go home and review the footage captured by my car. Luckily, I have the entire thing recorded. The moment that he almost hit me, his wife throwing the bottle at me, his face as he's yelling at me, his license plate, and even trying to ram me, it's all recorded, and a few days later, the officer calls me and confirms the license plate that I have in the video with my recording that he has from the freeway on and off ramps. But a week and a half has passed, and there's been no update. While I understand that the law is the law, it's still unacceptable to me that this man could be so overtly aggressive on the road, threatening my life, the lives of his children, and the lives of everyone else on the road with just no sort of punishment. I was genuinely scared for my life, and in the process, both he and I endangered the others on the road. Ultimately, this has left me feeling very disappointed with the system. I mean, an act of violence was committed, and due to technicalities, the other driver just gets off. I'm trying to keep my retelling as factual as possible, but this really was a terrifying experience. Even in the past few days, I still feel a bit hesitant to overtake people and change lanes and all that, and I'm definitely not comfortable honking anymore. I really wish that I could say that this didn't get to me, but it has. But perhaps the creepiest and oddest detail of all is that the man was actually taking pictures of my car before the bang happened. Which I keep asking myself, what would he possibly want that for? I'll start by saying that I live in California, so rent and the cost of living are notoriously expensive here. So when my family was expanding, I decided to look for a home to rent that fit our needs better than our current 2-bedroom upstairs apartment. 2 active toddlers need room to run and play, right? So I started browsing for rental homes that fit our needs and income when I came across a 4-bedroom, 2-story remodeled house on an acre of land. It was fenced in, had a giant garage and shop, a basement, and it was in a decent area of town. Everything that was on the list of wants as well as needs was hit, and it was only $1,250 a month. I was beyond ecstatic, so I quickly made an appointment for a walkthrough and interview with the renters and the landlord. I arrived a bit early because, like I said, I was keen, with my 2 young children in tow. My husband was at work, so I brought my best friend to help keep track of my 2 extremely active and always curious toddlers. He was always at work, so it was oftentimes just the 2 babes and I. We're waiting for the landlord, who is an elderly woman, who had recently moved into an assisted living community as her aging made it difficult to climb the stairs to the 2nd-story bedrooms, and supposedly she was in the early stages of Alzheimer's and dementia as well. And so, that was who I was looking for. I was pretty surprised, though, when I see a car pull up, and it's a middle-aged woman and a younger man, who appears to be late 20s, early 30s. I find out, though, that it's the daughter and the grandson of the landlord or the owner of the house. And I'm like, okay, cool, no big deal. They're well-dressed, kind, and inviting. You know, all the things you want in a landlord. And as we take the tour, they could read the excitement on my face. They even reiterated that their mother or grandmother wants to rent to someone who has children. I think, wow, that's so awesome. She, the elderly owner, must be a family person. Great. The son even offered to look after my kids as I continued to tour the property. Of course, I politely declined, as I'm as paranoid and overprotective as they come in the parent world. At the time, I hadn't even left my kids with close family members alone. I was just worried about them getting hurt or not being properly attended to. But anyway, my husband and I turned in our paperwork to do background and credit checks and whatnot. I was a bit worried about the credit checks, as I was a few years out of school and an even worse relationship that pretty much destroyed my credit. But I think, what the heck, it's $45 and a leap of faith, and I just turned them in. I get a call a week or two later, not sure of exactly how long after, so it's just an approximate timeline, saying that my credit check came back and I didn't qualify, but that they would like to offer my family the rental anyway. I was ecstatic, but my husband, who worked out of town, more often than not as well, was informed shortly before that he would have to move out of town to accommodate his job. So we ended up having to turn down the offer on the rental, which was a bit of a bummer. We ended up finding another place in the new town, but I continued to keep up on the local news of our old town since I still had family there and I'd lived there for most of my life. Now one day, as I was browsing through the police arrest and report logs, I read about a man who was arrested for possession, producing, and distributing child porn, as well as a lot of other really disturbing things. Of course, I'm thoroughly disgusted by this report, even though I don't realize the name of the offender, so I continue reading about this awful incident, and then I see the booking log photo. And it's none other than that son, that same son who was doing the walkthrough of the house we were supposed to rent. The same son who was so accommodating of our family's lack of credit, and who also offered to watch my children as I checked out the rest of the house. I silently thanked God that day that I'm overprotective. It turns out, too, that he'd been in trouble for inappropriate sexual behavior when he was a minor, too, so it was known prior that he was a predator. What's worse, too, is that his disgusting mother enabled this behavior to continue by allowing him access to children through his aging and likely unaware grandmother's rental property's tenants. Needless to say, I was overwhelmed and thoroughly disgusted with the mere thought of all of the disturbing what-ifs if we had actually, in fact, accepted the offer to rent from that sicko and his accomplice of a mother. This happened one late afternoon in early November of 1984 in McAllen, Texas. So I had just finished my homework and my younger brother and his friend challenged me to a game of touch football. I was 16 and my brother, Juanito, was 10 and his friend, Carlos, was only 12. We were going to play on the street. Our street didn't have a lot of traffic, mostly just people who lived there. Our mailbox marked one end zone, and the mailbox of Carlos's house, which was 4 houses down and across the street from ours, was the other one. Juanito and Carlos walked to their end of the field, which was the street in front of Carlos's house. I was facing west towards the sunset, but although the sun had not gone down yet, it was just below the tree line of the orchard 2 blocks away, so I couldn't see it. The neighborhood was really quiet. I could hear Carlos and Juanito talking, planning out who was going to receive the ball and who was going to block me. I've also checked on Google Maps recently, and they were approximately 40 yards away from me. So, kickoff would consist of me throwing the ball to them since it was a no football, and they just weren't really good for kicking. I mention this because that meant that I was actually holding the football, ready for a pass. So there was a small tree, really kind of an overgrown bush, about 8 or 9 feet tall, on the yard of the house to my right. And out of the corner of my eye, I suddenly saw the tree light up, and I remember thinking that it was too early for Christmas lights. Then I started hearing this electrical sizzling and the small dry branches of the overgrown bush crackling and kind of snapping. I turned to look at the bush just as a green sphere floated out the top of the tree. The sphere began to float across the yard and into the street. It floated across the street in a straight line, and at its closest point it was about 20 feet from me and about 10 feet in the air. The sphere was larger than a basketball and seemed to be made of clear glass about 3 inches thick. There was a swirling green liquid inside the glass sphere. Around the sphere was a green fog that extended about a foot off the surface of the sphere, and I could see little green lightning bolts shooting from the surface of the sphere to the edge of the fog. The sphere didn't make any sound as it floated by, and I still remember very clearly thinking that I could easily hit it with the football. And I began to cock my arm back to throw it, but I just suddenly had this sense that I was being observed, that there was something or someone in the sphere, and that they might shoot back if I attacked them. So I just stood there and watched the sphere float into the yard to my left, the yard of our next door neighbour. It moved in a straight line and at the same height as it was when it popped out of the tree until it was about 3 feet from the roof of my neighbour's house, and then it sloped up, following the slope of the roof, and then sloped down as it continued to follow the roof line of my neighbour's house. I continued to look in that direction until I couldn't see the glow of the sphere, and then I turned back to my brother and Carlos, and I kicked off. Juanito and Carlos were still a bit distracted, so I was able to touch Carlos pretty quickly. We had played 3 downs before Juanito looked at me and asked, "What was that?" I said, "I don't know," and Juanito said to me, "I'm scared, let's go home." We watched Carlos run into his house, and then we just ran home, and it's been 35 years since that day. My brother and I talk about it every few years, and I still remember it like it's happening right now. Let me start by saying that this story is 100% true. Every time that I tell it, or think about it even, I get goosebumps. I'll spare you some time though, and avoid the lengthy post of details, and I'll try and hit the key points. So a few years back, my son and I visited a historic landmark near our home. I personally have had experiences with ghosts in the past, and it was Nemencolin Castle in Brownsville, PA, to be exact. So I personally have had experiences with ghosts in the past, and I wasn't opposed to having an experience at the castle. It was well known that it was quite active, in fact. It was featured on My Ghost Story, if you're familiar with the show. For the intro, the tour guide told us about the history of the castle, the families that had lived there, the tragedies as well, and I'll admit that I forgot some of the other details, but I remember her encouraging photos from people on that tour. She mentioned the possibility of capturing ghosts and mentioned the shadow man that is often photographed. Moving along, though, we went through the castle from top level to bottom. There were a few rooms that I had feelings in, but no sightings or anything. But I think that they're worth mentioning because it adds some context. So room 1, we were taken into a nursery. It was furnished as it would have been way back when it was occupied by the original owners. The story was that a child that had lived in that home had passed away suddenly, and her playful spirit remained. I believed it to be true because prior to the story, I swore that I heard a child laughing as we made our way down the hall. Room 2. This room had large windows and a small bed off to the side. And the moment that I walked into the room, I imagined a woman laying in the bed, older, and slowly fading away. Her deathbed, if you will. The tour guide proceeds to tell us a story about a woman who lived in that room. I had to ask, "Ma'am, what's her story?" And she replied, "Well, she passed away in this room. She actually died in that spot right there in that bed." And at this point, I'm thinking, okay, I'm in tune here, and I'm expecting something to happen. There were many other rooms, but besides being a bit creepy, I don't really have much to say on them, so I'll skip all of those details. But we took several pictures, as everyone does when you visit a haunted house, hospital, or whatever. We even had the tour guide take a photo of the two of us. I didn't review any of the photos until going home, as I was mostly concerned with enjoying the tour. When we left, though, we discussed our time in the car and we exchanged our eerie feelings, confirming that this place was indeed haunted and wishing that we had seen something maybe. That night, my son went to sleep and my wife and I were laying in bed just watching some TV. We were discussing the tour and I suddenly heard a man's voice outside of our bedroom window. The window was closed and it was winter time, but the voice was so loud from screaming that I could hear, "You shouldn't be here. Are you out of your mind?" I then heard another man yell, "There's nothing you can do." I actually became irritated, and I opened the door to the balcony to go out and tell these men to stop arguing in the middle of the night by my home. And I'm telling you guys, when I opened that door to find complete silence out there and nobody standing around, all of the hair on my body stood straight up. I knew something was going on right there and then, because there was just no way that these men just ran off or anything. I would have seen them for sure. The street was long enough both ways, and my home stood alone. And I mean, I heard arguing, and literally 2 seconds later, just complete silence and nothing. It didn't make any sense. My wife was pretty spooked, but I told her no worries, they must have left. And after that, we just decided to get some sleep. In the middle of the night, though, I had an experience that was honestly just insane. I was having a nightmare that a man was attacking my wife, and she was so upset and frantic and calling for my help, and I was fighting this guy off. Now, sure, we all have nightmares, but here's the kicker. I woke up, but I couldn't move, and I was experiencing sleep paralysis. And all I could hear was my wife next to me crying and trying to speak, but her voice sounded muffled. So I'm fighting this weight on me so I can help her. I finally can move, and I kiss her on her forehead and tell her that it's okay, I'm here. I look over at the clock, and it's 3 a.m., and without missing a beat, she says, "I was having a nightmare. This man was attacking me, and you fought him off, but when I woke up, my body was stuck, and I couldn't move. I could look around the room, but I couldn't speak. I kept yelling for you, but nothing would come out." And that right there freaked me out so bad, because we had both had the same nightmare and experienced the same sleep paralysis at the exact same time. And it was then that I knew that it was something from this place that we had just visited. Something had followed me home. I finally got out of bed after talking to my wife, who had no intention of going back to sleep after that. I offered to go and get us both some water. I returned to the bed, and we continued talking until somehow we both drifted back off to sleep. The next morning at breakfast, we were just silent, still kind of freaked out, wondering if this was going to be an ongoing thing. My son comes down to join us, and he says, "Mum, when did you leave my room last night?" My wife looks at him, strange, and says, "What? I wasn't in your room last night." And he kind of laughs and says, "Yeah, okay, Mum, you definitely were, because I remember waking up to you laying down in my bed, rubbing my hair and kissing my forehead. It was at 3 a.m. I felt your hair when I rolled over, and then I just went back to sleep." And when he told us that, I just about lost my mind. I mean, you're telling me the same exact time that we were being haunted, something appeared to our son in the form of my wife? Like, listen, I don't understand it all, but that would freak anyone out, right? What's even crazier, though, is that later that day, I looked through the photos that I took, and there was a picture of me and my son, with a shadow man super tall in between us. So at this point, I'm like, man, I gotta make this thing just go away. My wife kept complaining about weird stuff happening in the house. Our house was unusually dark inside too, which was weird. Even with the blinds open, it seemed just like light wouldn't shine in like it used to. It got so bad, in fact, that one day I just got fed up and I was home alone, and I remember yelling like a crazy person saying, "You're not welcome here." I just had enough at this point, and shortly after, this huge weight just felt like it was lifted off my shoulders, and at the home too. Light was shining in as it had prior, and it was just crazy to me. Anyway, there you have it. The craziest experience I ever had, and I'll never forget it. I still want to know who it was and why it happened in the first place, because none of it makes much sense at all. So this happened this summer in northern Ontario, Canada, near the town of Parry Sound. Me and my friend had headed up north to spend some time at my granddad's cabin. He shares it with a few other hunters and was next to a very long lake. You actually need to take a boat to get to the cabin, in fact, and I'd gone up there a few weeks prior just to wander around and help my dad with some repairs and improvements that he was making to the cabin. While I was there, I looked on a printout of the satellite map that they had of the camp area. There was no Wi-Fi in the cabin, and it was sort of in a valley, and it's very hard to get any sort of signal. And I noticed that there was a small lake north of the one that we were at, and there was also a small island inside of that lake. Me and my dad took the boat to the area and found a nice pristine little island. We didn't go in it, only looked at it. And there was a nice lake with some swampy areas, a small fiberglass boat that the hunters used to hunt ducks in the lake sometimes, near to the right of where we were. The lake was much higher than the one that we came from, and it would have been impossible for us to take the boat that we came in up the hill to the lake. So, me and my friend headed back to explore said island. We headed up the hill, and we noticed that there was a small gorge that led into the lake. It used to be a river, but it was blocked up by a beaver dam by the looks of things. Me and my friend started to walk through it, and I started to feel uneasy, simply because of the increase of bugs in the gorge, and being slightly afraid of running into a beaver pissed off due to us being so close to its home. Turns out, too, my friend was feeling the same feeling, but he couldn't figure out why. He just felt that there was something weird about this lake. We left the gorge, though, and made our way up to the top of the hill where the lake greeted us. We overturned the boat, and after a few failed attempts of trying to launch it, we eventually made it to the lake. Now, I've got to say, too, that I'm almost 6'4", and my friend is around 5'7", so trying to fit us both in this tiny boat, plus our bags, definitely made it a bit challenging. Along with there being only one oar, we planned on bringing two, but thought that one would be good enough. We made our way to the middle of the lake, aiming for the island, with my friend rowing the boat. We both were still feeling a bit uneasy, but I just put it down to being in a small boat that could honestly tip over if one of us sneezed, and two, being almost an hour from any town or hospital, so we were kind of worried about being hurt or stranded at the time. But apart from that, we were both honestly feeling okay. That is, until the boat just stopped moving. We were in the middle of the lake with a small swamp in front of a rock face around 20 feet away from our left and woods to the right. We could see the water around us moving, with the wind creating a slight wave. We carefully looked below us to see if we'd hit a sandbar or something, but we didn't see any sand beneath us, only just the dark black waters of the lake. We put the oar in the water and we didn't feel any current. We found, though, that we could move to the left and the right, but just not forward. It almost was like we had kind of hit an invisible wall in a video game or something. We both felt the boat start to sink down, almost like it was being sucked into the lake. My friend started to row to the right, and we made our way to the right, and then once near the coast, we made it to the island. From far away, the island seemed to be nice and pristine, but once you got close to it, we could see that it seemed kind of desolate. The trees were dead and dying. The island was covered in stone, pine needles, and dead stuff, with the swamp and decay covering the lake. We tied the boat to a sturdy, although dead pine tree, and we spent some time on the island just checking it out, looking for anything of interest. After spending some time on the island and running out of bug spray, we just decided to head back to the cabin. My friend took the oar, and we started to prod the water around the island to find a good place to kind of portage out of there, and around this time, both me and him started to feel just a great sense of unease. Personally, it felt like that feeling of just pure dread, sort of like the feeling of when you get a test that you failed back, mixed with every instinct in my body saying, "Get out of here, you're gonna die if you stay." It was around this time, too, when we heard some commotion in the water and looked and saw around 10 feet away from us that there were some geese running into the water, and right where they came from, we saw what looked like a black shape scuttle or crawl behind some rocks. Kind of like a mix of, I guess the closest thing I can think of would be something in Star Wars, like when the Jawas go behind the rocks. My friend also said that he heard a strange noise, but I didn't notice it. We also had noticed, too, that the lake had gotten awfully still all of a sudden, and that the forest had fallen completely quiet. We found a good place to portage from, and we decided that I would row back. As we headed back, I looked back to where we started from, and I saw a strange black stick-like figure standing from where we left. At this point, I want to point out too that I just kept rowing. I would row for around 7 minutes, then take a short break, but whenever we would take a break, we could hear the crunching of leaves and the breaking of branches following us in the woods. I hugged the coast as we headed back, and even when staying around 12 feet away from the shore, I could see the bottom of the lake. We eventually got back though, and we put the boat back where we found it. When we tipped it over though, we noticed that there were heaps of scratch marks all over the bottom of the boat that looked like, honestly, something had tried to claw it open. As we started to leave, we decided to take one last look at the beaver dam, where we soon noticed that there was a cave behind the dam. And upon seeing that, we decided that we just need to get the heck out of here. We made our way back to the main lake, where we used our walkie-talkie to tell my granddad to come and pick us up. He was with some hunting buddies that day. On another note too that I forgot to add, we tried to walkie-talkie him on the island, but we couldn't get a signal. But as we left, I looked back and I saw the figure standing on the island again. Later that night too, as me and my friend were at the fire pit next to the cabin, we started to hear this strange noise coming from the woods, almost kind of like a person trying to make the hoot sounds of an owl. Although, this could have very well been my granddad's hunting buddies in the cabin. Who knows? But yeah, that's the gist of it. So, I'm just really interested to know what everyone thinks about this, as I have no idea what to think about it, and any opinions on it would be fantastic. So, to start off, a few years ago, I had this terrifying experience that I wish nobody to go through. And what happened was that I'd been sleeping peacefully one night. Everything was normal, but I had suddenly got the worst feeling just come over me, which caused me to wake up. Like, it felt as though I was being closely watched. But at the time, I didn't think much of it, and just kind of casually woke up, and that's when I realized what was making me feel so uncomfortable. I saw this shadowy figure of a creature looking straight at me, and I swear that I thought it was looking straight into my soul. It was located at the right side bottom of my bed, and I froze up because my first thought was to try and quickly get off the left side of my bed and run to the door, but I physically couldn't because I felt like it knew what I was thinking. The staring match lasted for probably about an hour before I finally got the courage to say, screw it, and I tried to get out of the room because in my head I finally thought that it wouldn't be able to hurt me because it shouldn't be able to, just being a shadow. So quickly I got off the left side of my bed, but the traumatizing thing was that it somehow knew what I was going to do and mirrored my actions 10 times faster and got to the bottom of the left side of the bed, and the way it moved sounded like long nails hitting off the flooring of my room. Before I could do anything, it pounced at me, and I screamed like bloody murder because I thought it was going to kill me, but nothing happened, and when I opened my eyes, it wasn't there anymore. The whole situation just kind of left me stumped because after that experience, my life got a little bit rougher. The place it happened in was my grandparents' house, and their house has always been alright and no supernatural background at all. But after that experience, my gran had been acting more negative towards me, and I've only just realized it recently that it was around the same time as that we'd experienced. And because of it, I decided to move out to live with my mum in a different country. I've never told my grandparents about the experience, but they keep telling me on the phone saying that my old room keeps creaking, or they hear scratching noises as if something is running around in my room, but I don't know how because my room has always been quiet, even when I was living there. I'm just super stumped at the moment because I don't know what to think. So this took place when I, 25 female, was about 11 or 12. I was walking home from school one afternoon, which didn't take very long as I lived in the same neighborhood. I was on the same road as my house when a car pulled over to me, and the guy driving complimented me on my shoes. He seemed to be in his 20s or 30s and had a really friendly atmosphere around him that I didn't initially question. My shoes weren't anything special, just black skater-type shoes with 3 pink stripes on either side. He said that his daughter would love those shoes and he wanted to buy her the same kind. He inquired if he could ask me some questions about them, and I got a weird vibe immediately, but being so close to my house and being unbelievably naive, I agreed to answer his questions. He pulled over and parked up just in front of me and opened his driver's side door. He beckoned me over and started asking typical questions such as where I got them, how much, were they good quality, stuff like that. I didn't know the brand of the shoes, so I slipped it off to check the label, while balancing on one foot. He said that he wanted a closer look, so he kept trying to get me to go closer, and he asked to see my shoe. And being so young and stupid again, I agreed. Luckily, I didn't go closer to the car, but instead I just kind of tossed him the shoe. He kept suggesting that I should rest my socked foot on his car, as he was concerned if my balance faltered that my sock would get dirty. This had gotten too weird for me, though, and I began to ask for my shoe back, suggesting that my mother was waiting for me. But then he proceeded to bring my shoe up to his face and inhaled deeply. He turned to me with a huge smile, complimenting me on how wonderful my shoe smelled, how soft and sweet my feet must be, and similar comments. It was at this point that I was truly done with this interaction, shoe back or not. So I demanded for my shoe back, as I didn't want to explain to my mother why I came home with only one shoe. He eventually handed it back to me, after first trying to Cinderella it on my foot, me obviously declining, and then just drove off. I was so embarrassed at my stupidity and naivety that I didn't tell that story until years later, and I hope no other kids were as idiotic as I was that day. So yesterday, Saturday morning, my kid, too, has been running out the back door and having us chase after her. It's a bit of a naughty habit and can be quite scary when she bolts out the door like that. So she did that again, and I ran out after her, saying her name and then wait for Mummy. She's just gone down the deck stairs and I'm right there behind her when there's these gunshots and a man running right in front of us in the alleyway behind my house, with a smaller silver handgun pointed down the alleyway behind him. He's in a black pleather jacket and green hoodie, scarcely older than a teenager, but has a determined or confident, unflappable air to him that just sends chills down my spine. I can't even describe it, but he's so close that there isn't time to do anything more than grab my child and duck behind the chicken coop. City hens are actually allowed here. I guess I figured that he'd just keep running down the alley and we could crouch there till he disappeared. Only he doesn't. He hangs a hard left and jumps my neighbour's fence, the neighbours whose yard borders my chicken enclosure. This guy walks within feet of us, starts to exit my neighbour's gate. Then, and this moment will stay with me for an eternity, he hears my toddler's scream crying, the only sound around at that moment, and he stops, with his hand on his gun, and turns to look for the source of the crying. I really can't hide any more than I'm hiding, and if he turns his head even an inch more, he'll definitely see us. Somehow, though, I squeeze and lean just enough out of sight that he just doesn't see us. There was something in his very calm energy that just petrified me. A shooter who just had a gun battle in the middle of the day in a family neighborhood seems to give absolutely no fucks, naturally, if others are hurt. But I had this horrible cold dread just all over me at that moment, that if he turned all the way and saw us, saw me, saw my expression, he would have had no choice but to have shoot me, because my face said, "I saw what you did." It was the most terrifying moment of my entire life so far. I felt perched between the utter peril and life, the breathing, screaming life in my arms. Would he turn that little gun on us? But somehow, incredibly, miraculously, amazingly, as though the pull of investigating the crying, so close to him, was suddenly overwhelmed by his desire to just get the hell out of Dodge. He puts his gun in his pocket, exits through the gate, runs across the street, jumps the across the street's neighbor's fence, and disappears. I smacked my kid's head in haste to get us back inside. "Sorry, kid," and, freaking out, pulled all the curtains and locked the doors, and then spent 10 long minutes getting put on hold by 911. When the cops arrived, I gave my eyewitness account, and my neighbour, who had been about to take out her trash and saw it all, gave the same account. They caught the guy that he was shooting at, but they never actually caught the shooter that I saw, and it still sends chills down my spine. I mean, what if he comes back? What if those bullets had struck my toddler running towards the shooter? A little girl was recently killed in the exact same way at a park that we frequent, sprayed with bullets from a gun battle in the middle of the day, in the middle of a playground. It just makes me sick to my stomach, and I'm not even sure that I want to live in this city or country anymore. About 7 years ago, I was 20 years old, going to college and trying to make a little extra money, and I picked up a job working in Flint, MI, as a live-in caregiver for a 98-year-old woman named Lillian, who had Alzheimer's. Honestly, I wasn't trained the way that I should have been to properly care for her. I did a lot of research, and I tried my best to learn everything that I could to make the situation as comfortable as possible for her. Needless to say, though, I did get frustrated sometimes. One of those times was a hot summer night, probably around 2 a.m, when I awoke to Lillian screaming from her bedroom. I ran to her to find her sitting in her laundry basket. After helping her up, I also noticed that she had unfortunately wet herself. I took her to the bathroom to get her cleaned up, and she told me that she thought that the laundry basket was the toilet, and after she had sat in it, she couldn't get out. I felt really sorry for her, obviously. I tried my best to reassure her that it would be okay. I told her that I would clean everything up, run her laundry again, and stay up the rest of the night, just in case she needed anything. Once Lillian fell back to sleep, I threw her laundry in, and I decided that I had time to sneak out for a quick cigarette. Yes, I'm one of those nasty, horrible smokers. So I decided to sit in my car to use the air conditioning to stay cool and call my best friend to see if she was still up so I could vent a little. Also, I just wanted to talk to someone as it was late at night and I was alone in my car. Being female, we're wired to be nervous about being alone at night, unfortunately. So I hadn't been on the phone for more than 2 minutes, I'd say, when I just got a weird feeling. Something was just telling me to look over my left shoulder, and when I did, I saw a younger guy, maybe late teens, early 20s, walking down the sidewalk in my direction with a sweatshirt on. His hood was up, and remember too that this is in the middle of summer, so immediately I felt as though something was off. But I reasoned, who am I to say that this guy isn't cold? One of my flaws is being too afraid to hurt people's feelings, even when the situation calls for it. I knew in that moment that I needed to lock my doors, but I didn't want this guy to hear the sound of my doors locking and feel like I thought that he was a criminal just for walking down the sidewalk like that. My body is screaming warning signs at me. The hair on the back of my neck was standing straight up, and it felt hard to breathe. I knew my friend was still talking, but I couldn't really hear a word that she was saying. I was afraid to turn my head to see where he was, and I was just frozen. When suddenly, my friend's voice became clear to me, and she was yelling at me, "Hey, why aren't you answering me? What's going on?" I turned my head to the right, just in time to see him reaching for my passenger door handle. Without even having time to think, I somehow managed to reach up with my left hand and hit the lock button for the doors, just as he started pulling at the handle. His right hand was in the front pocket of his sweatshirt. He seemed to be holding onto something, and with his other hand, he was pulling at my handle with such force that the entire car was jerking back and forth. I didn't move, I didn't scream, I just kind of watched him. I remember his eyes staring straight into mine, and man, he looked angry. Just as I started to think that this is it, he's going to get in somehow, he's going to hurt or kill me, he just suddenly stops. He stood there for a quick second and then turned and ran away. In that moment, I just burst into tears. I was scared, angry, and confused. I mean, what the hell just happened? What was he trying to do? Kill me? Steal my car? Is he going to come back? And lastly, even though I was happy about it, why did he suddenly stop and just run away like that? I called 911 and the dispatcher asked me if there was any way for me to leave the area. I wanted to, but then I realized, Lillian. I needed to get back in that house, but I was terrified to step foot out of my car. I took a few deep breaths and I decided that I didn't have time to think about it. I needed to make sure that she was okay. I got back in the house and immediately went to her room, and thankfully, she was sound asleep. I felt a huge sense of relief when I saw her, and I took a walk through the house and checked all the doors and the windows to make sure that we were safe. Everything was secure, and I sat down on the couch in the living room in the dark and waited for the cops to come. For those of you who don't know much about Flint, this type of call is not their top priority at all. It took them over 4 hours to respond, and at that point, obviously, there is nothing that they can do, because he was long gone. I still think about that night more often than I would like to admit as well. The what-ifs are definitely the hardest part. All I know is that I hope to never be in a situation like that again. Well, a while back ago, I was maybe 16 at the time, and my uncle was getting married and my family loves him, so we flew to Mexico to go and celebrate. I got my hair done and wore a dress, so I looked nice. My uncle and my new aunt were happy, so after a week, we went back home. Once I got home, I noticed a message from a stranger on Messenger, and also a friend request from the same guy. The text message read, "Hello, I'm your cousin, a relative of your mother. I saw you in the wedding." I found it strange, but he was confirmed family because he sent a selfie of himself in the wedding, also one in my grandma's living room. Also, his friends in common were also some of my aunts and my mum too, so I knew that he wasn't lying. Also, he's like in his mid-30s, so he was like an uncle, not really a cousin in my eyes. And he may have said that to seem younger. That's what I felt because he kept trying to seem younger in the texts. But anyway, I, being the nice person that I was, just said, "Oh, okay, what's going on?" And he texted back, "Nothing, just wanted to say hello." I texted back, "Pleasure to meet you," and he then texted me, "I hope I'm not bothering you by texting you. Tell me about yourself. Do you have a boyfriend? Are you married or single? How old are you?" I got a little uncomfortable about this, but I answered, "I don't have a boyfriend and I'm 16. He kept bringing up some musicians in order to have some connection with me. He said that he liked Katy Perry, not knowing that I was a punk kid. So I told him about the bands that I liked, and he said that we had similar music tastes, which honestly made me laugh seeing how untrue that was. He then asked me 3 times if I had a boyfriend, and then told me that he had no girlfriend, and also kept trying to talk about myself. We talked about movies that we liked. Again, for some reason he kept bringing up kids' films. I think that it was in hopes that it could be another thing that we had in common. But I was into horror films and sent him pictures of like Donnie Darko and Child's Play, and he then sent one of the Smurfs movie poster, once again saying that we have similar interests, or wanting me to agree with him. He then asked me if I worked out, and I said no. He then told me, "Sad that you don't live here. If not, I could have invited you to work out with me." I didn't respond, and he sent a picture of a lady. He told me that it was his ex of 4 years and that she was really hot, and in his words, he texted me back, "You are also very hot, Melissa." After that, I didn't text him ever again because I felt really uncomfortable. I didn't tell my mum too because, knowing her, she just wouldn't care. I haven't seen that guy since I haven't visited my grandma since that wedding. He also hasn't texted me since that, but it was just really creepy. Also creepy thinking about the fact that my own cousin may have been staring me down at the wedding, and somehow found my Facebook account, which I really don't post pictures of myself in, thank God. This just happened to me in the bathroom at my college. So, I walked into the bathroom at my community college, and there's another guy in there, and he's at one of the 2 urinals. I walk in and step up to the other urinal, and from the moment that I walked in to the moment that I unzipped my pants, this guy was just staring at me. In my head, I thought, maybe this guy is on the spectrum or something, because our college has a lot of students that are special needs and is a great place for them to get a degree and has really good programs to work with them. So it felt a bit off, but I thought maybe it's nothing. And boy, do I wish that that was where the interaction ended. He finished before me, and he went over to wash his hands. I was just waiting for him to finish up and leave the restroom because it felt really weird. And while I'm still at the urinal and this guy is washing his hands, he looks at me and says, "You're a complete stranger, so you won't judge me. Is it wrong of me to take out my anger on people that I don't know?" My first thought was, this guy isn't right, but I should probably listen. But I answered and I said, "No, that's not right. That isn't healthy for you or the other person." He answers, "That's the conclusion that I've come to as well. Thanks." And he then just turns and walks out of the bathroom without even drying his hands. I don't know about this guy. I have a bad feeling about him, and I don't know what to do about this situation. So, I totally forgot about this happening until my mum brought it up at dinner tonight, and now it's 9:30 at night, and I'm scared all over again. So this was back in high school, either my freshman or sophomore year. I missed the bus, and I didn't have a car at the time, so my mum had to drive me to the school. The road that my tiny neighbourhood, more like a glorified cul-de-sac, was off of a long rural stretch that only had one equally tiny other neighbourhood and a few houses here and there. But it was 6 a.m. or something and still incredibly dark outside, and it was colder than a witch's tit. And as we're pulling out of our neighbourhood, my mum and I both saw 3 children in blue and white private school uniforms standing side by side, shoulder to shoulder at the entrance of the neighbourhood on the sidewalk. It was either 2 girls and 1 boy, or 2 boys and 1 girl. I don't remember the ratio, but the girls wore a blue and white skirt, kind of a dress outfit, and the boy was wearing a blue short-sleeved shirt with khaki shorts. This was weird for a few reasons. One, it was 40 degrees outside. They looked like they were dressed for summer, and they didn't even wear coats or anything. Secondly, there were 2 schools in the area, but not a private school till the next town over, and the blue and white weren't the school's uniform colours anyway. Third, what young kids just stand there in single file line, not doing anything but just standing? No joshing around, no nothing. Oh, and lastly, this wasn't even where the bus stop was. It was a few blocks down. And just to sprinkle an extra bit of creepy on top for shits and giggles, there weren't any streetlights there, so what were they doing there? They were just seemingly standing in the dark, not doing jack except being creepy as hell, I guess. They were on the corner on the right, closest to the passenger side window where I was obviously sitting, and of course we were turning right. As we got closer, I thought at first that they didn't have any faces, but it was just too shadowy and dark out to make it out, and the headlights only shone under their shoulders, which is how I can remember the outfits so vividly, by the way. Then we got closer, and I was relieved to see that they actually had faces, but then got completely freaked out all over again when I saw their eyes were all completely black. Kind of like Supernatural Sam and Dean fighting demons all black. My mum actually saw it before I did, and she put the pedal to the metal and she just hightailed it straight out of there. I remember trying to look back and see them, but I couldn't since it was just too dark. My mum didn't go back home until the sun rose and it was bright enough to not get scared anymore. Of course, nobody believed me at school and my siblings thought that we were full of it. But we know what we saw. We never saw them again after that, though, and I thought that they were ghosts for some time, but a few months after that, I heard about the black-eyed children on YouTube or something, and I made the connection. We moved shortly after that due to unrelated reasons. This was like 4 years ago now, I think, and I had blissfully forgotten about it, until my mum said, "Hey, remember when?" And now I just want to die. And well, I hope my irrational anxieties and fears around children that are small enough for me to punt across a soccer field are amusing at least to some. So I'm a respiratory therapist and I work nights in an emergency room. I've been working in this field for a few months now and I've seen some pretty bizarre and weird things. So I'd figured that I'd share one of them in hopes to clear my head. I work in a decently large hospital in the middle of nowhere in Pennsylvania. I mostly do work in the emergency room, but have also worked around the other floors of the hospital. Just the other night, in fact, a patient came in around 4 in the morning. It was an 18-year-old female who her family found standing on top of their shed in the middle of the night, and when her parents saw her and screamed, she fell and broke her femur. She came into the ER, and I was told by her nurse to check in on her whenever she was settled in her room, so when I did, I was a little shocked when she was still in a daze and her leg was just torn to shreds. I could see it through the bandages, and when I walked in, she just stared and didn't say a word. I was about to introduce myself when all of a sudden she just lets out a scream, and not just any scream. It was a scream like that of an animal caught in a bear trap. After this, the nurse ran in and she started yelling numbers like 1, 2, 3, 4, but in random order. And after this, she just passed out and went unresponsive. She got moved up to one of the basic care floors, and last night I went to check on her and she's doing okay. The weird thing though is that now she's like a completely different person. I don't know what happened to this poor girl, but it was scary to say the least. When I was a child, my parents and I lived in a really rugged trailer on the family farm. Shortly after that, the farmhands living in the farmhouse that was down the path through the woods moved out, and we had the opportunity to move into an actual house. The trailer that we'd been living in had no plumbing or HVAC. We had an outhouse for using the bathroom and showering and whatnot. And to put it short, we pretty much lived like hicks. So, at 7 years old, I was pretty damn excited to move into a house that had all of those things, and a staircase for me to run up and down with. It even had a basement. My great-grandfather, alongside of a good friend, actually built the house with their bare hands in 1950. It was inscribed in the wall down in the basement. Now, to give a little bit of context, this friend of my grandfather's had fallen and hit his head hard on a rock during a snowstorm one night, heading back to the house, and had fallen unconscious. His wife found him hours later and managed to wake him up and help him back home. But unfortunately, later that night, he died. My parents told me later, when I was much older, that strange things began to happen in that house not long after we moved in. They would wake up to small things like the faucets being turned on in the bathroom or the toilet flushing. The television would turn on in the living room and stuff like that. But then, things began to pick up. My mum would wake up sometimes to the sound of a man roaring in anger. After inquiring about all of these things to my grandfather, they learned of the family friend and his death. They soon learned to coexist with him, and it wasn't long before the spirit began to confront me. One of my earliest memories of an encounter with him was when I was 8. It was 2:30 in the morning. I've always been a bit of a light sleeper, so when I wake up in the middle of the night, I usually just brush it off. But this night, I felt just something strange in the air. Downstairs, I began to hear footsteps moving back and forth in the hallway. At first, I thought that it was just my dad, since he sometimes worked a 3 to 11 shift at the steel plant. But these footsteps didn't seem to be going anywhere, just kind of pacing. Then, after a pause, the footsteps began to make their way up the stairs towards my bedroom. My room was hardwood, so there was a gap underneath the door so you could actually see shadows underneath of it. And once the steps made it to the landing outside of my door, I could see the shadow of 2 legs. And the next thing I know, the doorknob began to slowly turn, and then my door slowly creaked open about 2 inches, just enough for someone to peer through. Suddenly, the shadows vanished, and I could see no one through the opening. I decided to be brave, and I got out of bed to see if anyone was still there. I slowly walked over to the door, and I threw it open, but when I did, there was nobody. Before moving out of that house, I had many more experiences with our family ghost. I learned that he was friendly and was only coming to check on me that night, and many nights to come as well. In a weird way, I kind of miss him, and I hope that he's found the other side. I won't lie though, that night that he came to my door, it scared the ever-loving crap out of me. This is a story from my childhood that has always stuck with me, and I wanted to share it and see what other people think. So my family and I had just moved into this new house. This was right after the housing market went way up in the 2000s. So the house that we were moving into was a complete dump because that's all that we could really afford in our school district. It had previously been a crack house. The windows were busted by the police, fence taken down by SWAT, needles in the garbage disposal, and it was just a complete dump. So my mum and stepdad were fixing it up before we finally moved in. We had a month to get out of the house that we were renting and get into our new house. My sister's dad would go over after work and paint, but we had to because everything was covered with graffiti. And he got home one night and he said, "When I got to the house today, I saw a little kid." This was after they had already replaced the windows, so nobody could have broken in. He said that he came into the house and he saw a kid go from one bedroom in the master to the other, and so he went into the master bedroom and nobody was there. At first he thought my mum had been there with my sister and I and had left somebody there or something, and when he realised that we were not there, he didn't really know what happened. My mum just told him that it must have been the fumes and open a window up and wear a mask next time. Keep in mind too that my stepdad really isn't the type of person to believe in ghosts or paranormal things, and he doesn't get scared easily, so this was really out of character for him. Right after we moved in though, almost instantly in fact, my sister had an imaginary friend, Whitehead, which was unusual because she was never a play-pretend type of kid. She never really played with dolls or anything for that fact. She was more of a computer game kid type of person. She was always very logical too and thought very scientifically. And even though very young at the time, it was just odd because she never had an imaginary friend before. My mum and I were always the more artistic and wacky ones, and my sister and her dad were the more logical ones. But just to give you some insight. Anyway, generally when a child invents an imaginary friend, it's because they want someone to play with, right? But her imaginary friend was super annoying and he was always bothering her. And she would constantly complain about Mikey not sharing a toy, or he won't play this game, or he touched my juice, he's not following rules and not taking turns. And I mean, who invents an imaginary friend so that they can fight with them all day? But one day though, my mum was out front just talking to my neighbour. She was telling my mum that before the people before us, there was another family with kids there. And then she asked if we ever saw anything weird in the house. She told my mum that the family before saw stuff in the house and that her son, who was now a teenager, when he was little, that he had an imaginary friend named Mikey. And the kids that lived in her house before us also played with Mikey and that she had seen him before. My sister and I would spend the weekends with our grandparents, and my mum would take the batteries out of all of our toys because they would just go off randomly when no one was in our rooms. In fact, I remember I had a piggy bank that made a noise when I put money in it, and one night it just wouldn't stop, so I checked to see if it was jammed, but nothing was up with it, so I ended up throwing it away because it just wouldn't stop going off in the middle of the night. Now, I had never had problems with sleeping before or after that house, but when we lived there, every morning I would wake up kind of contorted in some way. I would wake up shoved into a little space between my bed and the dresser in a ball, and I would always be stuck, and my mum would have to help me out in the morning. I would always try to figure out exactly how I got there, but I never really could. I was in 3rd or 4th grade at the time, and my mum had to put up guards on the side of the bed to stop me from doing it. But inevitably, I would still end up contorted and shoved between my dresser or something. This never happened when I would stay at my grandparents' though, which was really weird. My mum worked a night job and would stay home during the day with my sister as well. So one night, she came home from work and was washing her hands in the kitchen. From the kitchen you could see into the living room, and my mum turned around because she said that she could just feel someone watching her. And for a split second, there was a kid just standing there. She said that he looked about 8 years old, and then he was just gone. Not long after that, too, it was my sister's birthday. After the party, my sister and I went to my grandparents' house. My mum and stepdad were alone. My mum took all the balloons from the party and tied them together and put them in the corner in the living room. They were watching TV, and the air was off because the weather is nice around my sister's birthday, and the fan wasn't on. When all of a sudden, the strings came together like somebody grabbed it, and then they floated about a foot. Then they went around the corner and really slowly down the hallway. Then, once it got to the light in the hallway, the balloons went down and around the light. It went down to the end of the hallway and stopped at my sister's door. My mum and stepdad were watching in shock, not knowing what the hell to do. So my mum decided to talk to it, and she said, "Hey Mikey, if you want those balloons you can have them." Right when she said that, the balloons went into my sister's room. Now, there used to be a Taco Bell by our house, and this was before they started remodeling them, so it looked like a mission. So, my mum and my sister and I were driving past the Taco Bell, and my sister said, "Mum, Mikey says that he used to live in a Taco Bell house." Well, we didn't think anything of it, but after we had lived there for a while, my mum decided to look into the history of the property. Before, it had been a cattle ranch, and she then learned that before that, right on the property where our house and 3 others were, she found out that there was a children's mission. It was run by the Catholic Church, and they had orphans, and that was when it all clicked. One year my sister said too that it's Mikey's birthday and we have to make a cake. So my mum made a cake, and then she marked it with a little dot on the calendar. Then when she changed over the calendar the next year, she marked it with a dot again, just to see what would happen. And the following year, on the same day, my sister says it's Mikey's birthday and he would like a cake. At Christmas time, my mum went out and bought him a Hot Wheel and a little toy horse. A couple of days later, the horse just disappeared. My sister didn't touch it, and I had no idea where it went. And then, a couple of years later, when we were playing in the backyard, we actually found it buried in the yard. We brought it back inside and we put it on the coffee table, and that night it went missing again, and after that we still haven't seen it. So I was a picky eater and still am, but my stepdad used to make me stay at the table till I ate all of my food. I was also stubborn as a kid, so I would sit there until 10 at night sometimes, when he would finally just let me go to bed. But every night at that table, I would see shadows walking around the hallway from room to room. I would just think that I was seeing things, but it was constantly, almost every night in fact. Anyway, that's pretty much everything that I remember from that place. My mum and my sister and I moved out after my mum and stepdad split up. I haven't been back there since then, and my sister's dad still lives there, and she goes there on the weekends and whatnot. She's in high school now, but she still tells me that the house feels very heavy, and she sees shadow people all the time, but that's about it. I thought that I would just share this experience because, I don't know, I just find it interesting myself. Sorry if I jump around a lot, I just wanted to try and get most of it out there. I was young too, and it's hard to remember everything in order because it was so long ago. I have a lot of pictures from the house with weird stuff in it though, and I'll ask my mum for them, and hopefully I can post them here. Anyway, thanks for listening. This is my first time sharing this story, and hopefully it's not too hard to follow. This all happened about 8 years ago, and this is about my friend, A. I've known her since I was 15, and we were co-workers for about 5 years, and when I turned 18, we actually became roommates. Her boyfriend at the time also lived with us. So, A was just always kind of different. She was very religious and always talked about God and struggled with partying or smoking, without feeling guilty afterwards, that is. We would throw house parties. Nothing crazy, just a group of us playing beer pong, drinking, and maybe a little bit of weed. Nothing ever crazy happened, but literally, after every time, she would have to tell me that she can't do this anymore. She needs to focus on her relationship with God and whatnot. Yet, the parties were usually her idea, but I got so used to her being like that I just thought that that's her personality and I can deal with it. But about a year into us living together, her boyfriend decided to break up with her. And they'd been together since high school, and he's about 3 years older than her. So when this happened, I felt like this is where the chaos began. She starts to see a therapist and a psychologist because she went into a severe depression. I'm not sure why the doctor decided to put her on Adderall, but she tells me that she's being diagnosed with depression and ADD. I didn't really think much of it because I've known a few people in my life that take the same medication and it does seem to help them. But after a few months of her being on this medication, she drops a lot of weight and becomes way more spontaneous and did things that were just way out of character for her. She became very promiscuous too, and she would drive to San Diego, which is almost 3 hours away from where we live, to have one-night stands. It wasn't until another few months after that I noticed something was just really off with her. She started sleeping with one of our co-workers and got oddly jealous if anyone would just even talk to him. We all worked in the same department, so, we all kind of had to talk to each other. In fact, on one occasion, I asked if he would grab something from the back, and I turned around and she's just staring at me with this angry blank stare and says, "I know what you're doing." And I'm like, "What?" Because I literally had no idea what she was talking about. And she says, "I see the way you're looking at him. I know what you're trying to do." I say, "Are you being serious? Please tell me you're joking." And she says, "I see it. You can't lie to me. I know what you're trying to do. I won't let it happen." By this time, I was so pissed off that I just left work and I went home. Because she was 100% serious. It didn't freak me out so much as just kind of pissed me off. I've known this person for years. We lived and worked together. And how could she think that of me, let alone treat me like that? Anyway, after things got so bad with her, always accusing me of any little thing, like one minute she'd talk to me friendly, then the next she would accuse me of being in her room and going through her stuff. Eventually, I just moved out. And she went back to live with her grandma. We still worked together, but I actually asked if I could do different shifts to her if possible. And then after that, I didn't see her for almost 6 months because she just didn't come back to work. No one would tell me why or anything that happened, and it was almost a year when I got a Facebook message from her asking if she could see me and talk. So much time had passed that I wasn't angry, I was actually kind of worried. I wanted to talk to her to see if she was okay. By this time, I now live with my husband, so I tell her that she can come by my apartment. But when she showed up, I could hardly recognize her. She had gained a tremendous amount of weight. It looked like her hygiene had just gone out the window. Not to the point where she looked homeless or anything, but very much noticeable, especially from how she used to look. So I knew that she had gone through something. She didn't want to come in, so we went for a walk, and she begins to tell me what happened. She said that she had been diagnosed with schizophrenia, and it was drug-induced by the Adderall. And I guess that it started when she went on a hike with her family. She said that her dad apparently turned into a demon and was going to kill her. She tried to run away, but her family had to restrain her and call the cops. They had held her for 72 hours, and she said that it was like God gave her the ability to see who was a good person or bad by seeing them as demons or as people. She told me that she takes medication for it now, and she's going to this Bible study group that has really helped her and whatnot. I told her that that was great, and I'm always here, and I can't imagine what she's gone through. So we start to hang out a few times after that. I go to her apartment. It was like assisted living for people with mental disorders, once or twice a week just to hang out and talk with her. I never really thought of her as dangerous because, well, she was on her meds, and from what I've read and heard of schizophrenics, they aren't usually violent. Plus, she seemed somewhat well. But after about a month of hanging out, she keeps trying to get me to go to this Bible study group. I tell her that I'm not really interested in all of that, but she eventually becomes ridiculously persistent about it. She even started stopping by my apartment randomly trying to get me to go. And this is the point where I slowly stopped coming by because it was like every time we hung out, she always brought it up and just wouldn't let it go. A week goes by and I didn't really talk to her or answer her calls, and if I did, I just came up with an excuse as to why I couldn't come by. A part of me felt bad, I'll admit, but it was like something was telling me to just distance myself a bit. And the following Friday, my mum calls me and asks if I've read the newspaper. And she tells me that A is actually in it. And after reading it, I was just in shock. The night before A's mum stopped by her apartment, I guess that she was very upset and disorientated. Her mum tried to calm her down, but couldn't, so she tried to call the police because she was getting more aggravated and aggressive. And A ends up chasing and stabbing her mum 7 times. I come to find out later from her family that she had stopped taking her medication because God told her that she didn't need them. She thought that her mum was trying to kill her and was a demon, and her mum actually survived and was able to make it to the neighbours. I guess the police found her wandering around her apartment complex with a knife still in her hand, and they said that she wouldn't talk to anyone, just had this look on her face like she wasn't there. She didn't struggle or say anything. To think, though, that if I hadn't have distanced myself like I did, that could have easily been me. And quite honestly, the thought of her being violent like that just never entered my mind. It was just a really terrifying and heartbreaking story. It's almost as if I had to grieve for her because who she used to be no longer existed, and knowing who she was, she just didn't deserve that kind of life. I'm sorry that this is a bit long and probably not that well expressed, but anyway, that's my story of my friend A, and I hope she's doing well. This happened when I was in college. So, I was home in the summer, just working. My boyfriend was also home for summer, working, living with his parents, about an hour and a half away. But we finally had a rare day when neither of us needed to work, so we drove down to spend the day with me. We were saving for the coming school year, so we tried not to spend too much, which ended up meaning that we ate lunch and dinner with my family at my house. After dinner, wanting to get some alone time as a couple, we decided to pick up root beer floats at Sonic and drive out to a local state park where young couples like to hang out. We parked and walked out to one of the little covered picnic tables in the woods, and while the parking lot was well lit, because of how thick the woods were, it was quite dark sitting at the picnic table. We'd hung out there late into the night before, and we always felt perfectly safe. But for some reason, though, I just felt a bit nervous sitting in the dark that night. So when another couple popped out of the woods past where we were and started making out, leaning up against the other end of the table, we moved to my boyfriend's pickup. My boyfriend turned on the radio and we sat in companionable silence, attempting to eat our ice cream before too much of it melted. Due to the heat, we actually had the windows rolled down. After a bit, the couple that we'd seen come out of the woods left. Looking around, I realized something odd though. Although there were normally at least half a dozen vehicles parked in this particular lot on any given evening, we were now the only vehicle in sight. Even though I didn't think too much of it, and continued finishing up my float. But all of a sudden, I just got the worst feeling ever. You know that feeling when the hair stands on the back of your neck because you can feel someone just looking at you when you thought that you were alone? It started like that and just got way worse. I had the distinct feeling that I needed to run in the pit of my stomach, so I started looking around and realized my boyfriend was also looking around nervously. And about the same time, he noticed that I was doing it too. So I asked him if he had a bad feeling, and his reply was an emphatic hell yes, uttered as he started the truck and began to drive out of the park. Since we were facing into the park, we had to make a U-turn, and as we passed by the area where we'd been parked, a man stepped out of the edge of the woods. This happened on a Wednesday night, and about a week later, someone found bodies in those woods, just past where we'd been seated on that picnic table. When the crime was eventually solved, it came out that a man living in a shack on the property and working as a maintenance worker for the park had killed a couple the Saturday night after our experience. And the photo of the killer in the newspaper turned out to be the photo of the man that we'd seen step out of the woods and watch us leave that night. So I'm an Australian, but I have family that live in the States. 4 years ago, December of 2015, I was in Ohio for Christmas, staying with my sister. My sister, her husband, Jordan, and I were driving back to her house from a movie, and were pulling into a driveway when we heard a high-pitched screeching sound come from outside, away from our car. Assuming that it was just a bat or something, we all got out thinking nothing of it. But then we heard it again. It was around the time the sun was setting, but the noise was too low to the ground to be a bat. It sounded like it was coming from pretty close by, in fact. The noise wasn't unbearably loud or anything, but it was uncomfortably high-pitched, like higher than anything that I've ever heard. So by this point, we're all out of the car, and we hear it like one more time before Jordan goes over to the side of the house where he thinks the noise is coming from. He kicks some bricks around, picks up a couple of tiles, before we see it. Now, please understand, the following description may be slightly inaccurate as it has been 4 years since this time, but I swear that what I saw was actually there. I mean, both my sister and her husband saw the same thing too. It was vaguely humanoid. It was only about 2 or 3 feet tall, stark naked, bipedal, running away from Jordan towards us. Its head was massive compared to its body, and it was semi-translucent. You could see big veins all over it. It had beady black eyes, and I didn't get a chance to see if it had any genitalia, but from what I could notice, it didn't seem to. Upon approaching us, my sister screamed, and I instinctively jumped back, and it changed course and ran onto the road. It ran behind the house across the road, let out another screech, and that was the last that we saw of it. Jordan called the police, and we went inside. They didn't believe us, obviously, but all 3 of us remember the event quite vividly, and I'm wondering, has anybody from around Ohio seen anything like this? I've been working at a department store for the past 2 years. Although retail wasn't something I wanted to necessarily do, it was much better than my previous job in the food business, so I was grateful to not have to touch food all day, and would take the world of customer service much more gratefully than the food industry. It was in the middle of January, and the store is usually quite dead towards the end of the day. Usually, the following month after Christmas is never really busy, due to people probably not trying to spend money after the gift-giving season, and the cold weather of the winter season in Canada never really helped the situation much too. People are just not in the mood to leave the comfort of their own houses in the middle of a snowstorm, right? That meant too that they put less people on shift, and I was alone in the fitting room. I work at a pretty big store, and alongside the weather conditions, it meant that the employees were usually spread out on the floor, not within close proximity in comparison to what they put during the busy season. Also, none of us wore earpieces as we did most of our paging through the speaker system. So, it was a Wednesday night, around 8, and the store closed at 9. I was usually put on the cash register, but often frequented the fitting room when they needed the help. It was a very quiet night, and I spent the first couple of hours of my shift just helping organise the beauty section that is right next to the fitting room, or going to speak to my lovely co-workers who worked in the jewellery section, helping the few customers that actually wanted to try clothes on when they came by. There was a man who came to the fitting room, though, with 2 dress shirts, and I didn't think much of it. I mean, after all, he was nothing that I haven't seen before. Older, tall, kind of stocky, muscular, pretty plain to be honest. I did notice, though, that he seemed to be dressed rather nicely. A clearly expensive suit and a nice shoulder bag accompanying him. I assume that he must have come into the store after his day off work. I counted the number of articles that he was bringing in, as that was mandatory in order for me to monitor the flow of clothes and try to stop theft. Handed him a number corresponding to the number of articles that he was taking in and asked him to politely put the clothes back on the hanger. In French, obviously, rather than English, because Quebec requires us to speak French first to customers. To which he replied with a simple, "No problem." I noticed then, too, that he had a thick accent, although I wasn't and am still not able to actually place my finger on it. I think it may have been Russian, but I can't say for sure. But the man walked into the fitting room, and I helped the other customers who came out of their rooms, counting the articles that they came out with and matched it with the numbers, and hung them back on their place on the rack. A few moments passed by, and the man came out. Not really putting much thought into it, I took both dress shirts from him. He didn't want any of them, and took back his number, said thank you, and turned to place the clothes on their rack. Usually, this was the point where the customer would just leave the fitting room, but when I turned around to go back to the front, he was still there. I asked him if there was anything that I could do for him, or if he still wanted the shirts that I had just put away. The man smiled, looked at me, not answering, and I felt a weird feeling in the pit of my stomach. He was looking at me as if he wanted to say something, and me, being the 5'4" girl who hates confrontation of any kind, just kind of nervously laughed and started to organize the desk at the front of the fitting room entrance, awkwardly arranging all the numbers, although they were already in order. He asked for my name, to which I just looked down at the name tag I was wearing and I repeated it. He told me that it was a beautiful name. I laughed nervously at this, never knowing what to do in these sorts of situations, and being nice to him was a part of my job in customer service, so it's all that I could think of. Besides, he didn't do anything wrong, just complimented me. I said thank you, and I looked away to avoid eye contact. But then he just kind of stood there, for what felt like 20 minutes, but was probably closer to 3, I suppose. He stood there as I helped other customers, and it was beginning to make me feel very uncomfortable. But not wanting to be rude, and also not wanting to subject myself to being uncomfortable for the rest of my shift, or however long he was planning to be there, I asked him if there was anything else that he needed help with. And here's where I began to get a bit scared. He then proceeded to tell me that he'll be waiting for me at 9:30 outside the doors of our store. He wanted to take me out. Confused, I just kind of looked at him oddly, because how did he know that that was when we finished? The store closed at 9, that's true, but we usually spend 30 minutes cleaning up the store. I suppose that information isn't hard to guess, but it still felt a bit weird. Plus, why did he want to take me out? I once again laughed nervously, because that seemed to be the only thing that I was able to do when uncomfortable, and politely declined, saying that I had to get home and study. But then he laughed and took a step closer towards me, and I instinctively took a step back. And he didn't seem to accept that answer, because he just smiled once more and said, "I'll be waiting for you outside the door where all the employees leave from, in the truck alley. I'll be there." There was a door that employees exited the mall from, because the normal doors usually locked around 9:15, and we always finish later than that, so we take the door that takes us into a side alley where all the trucks go to drop off shipments for our store and whatnot. But again, being someone who hates confrontation, and who doesn't do well with controlling my emotions, I felt myself start to tear up at this comment. No employee is allowed to mention the door that we leave from. It's a company rule. Since we usually finish late and the parking lot is dark, they don't want anyone to know where we exit from, as a precaution. I told him once more that, while I appreciated his offer, that I just wasn't interested and I had to continue my work. I politely told him to leave when he put a hand on my shoulder and I felt myself instantly freeze up. I remember thinking, praying in fact, that one of my co-workers would show up and pick up the rack, or the jewelry employee would stop filling the cases and just turn around. Obviously, with my luck, nobody did though. He told me that I was a pretty girl and that he couldn't wait for me in the alley at the end of my shift. He said that he has a nice apartment and had a cute dog, as if the dog was going to change my mind or something, and we could have a fun time. Desperate now, I said that I just had a boyfriend and he was going to be picking me up, hoping that that would deter him, but he just laughed. He said my name, and then told me that that wasn't something that usually stopped him, placing his hand on my shoulder. I honestly really began to feel scared at this point, and I just excused myself to use the phone on my desk, shaking his hand off of me that I hadn't realized was actually gripped on me pretty tightly. I paged the number for my coordinator, who curtly replied before I was even able to get a word in that she was busy with a customer and just hung up on me. So, unsure of what to do, as the man was still next to me as he followed me up to my desk, I called my manager, who thankfully replied. When he saw that I was speaking with someone on the phone, he left the fitting room, but it didn't make me feel any better. I told my manager what had happened, and with good reason, she freaked out, telling me that I need to report him immediately, reminding me that with people like that, I really have to be careful. She told me to call security, which I did, and the security guard told me that he had an eye on him through the camera. So it was around 8:30 at this point, and I was getting ready to start my closing tasks, still paranoid about what the man had said. To be fair, I'm a bit of a paranoid person at best, and I watch way too many murder documentaries, so I may have been overthinking. But it did sound like the beginning of an abduction movie, honestly. I kind of calmed down after a bit, not seeing the man anymore, and when the security guard called me back, he wanted to let me know that the man had never left. In fact, the guy was now circling the store. I felt more dread than before pop up in my stomach because, he didn't leave. Thankfully, he hadn't come back to see me. I felt kind of better for the fact that the security guard had seen him, so if anything did happen, there was someone who was able to identify him. Once again, overthinking, I suppose, but by the time the store closed and it was time to leave, two of my co-workers, Evan and Ethan, two boys who worked in the warehouse, made sure to walk me all the way to my car, not letting me be alone. And boy, did I appreciate that. Although I didn't want to admit it, I was scared walking through that alleyway, and I was even more paranoid that he was going to follow me home. I took the extra long route to see if anyone was trailing me, to which he wasn't. And when I walked through the safety door of my house and locked it behind me, I let go of a breath that I wasn't even aware I was holding in. I make sure now to always leave the store using the buddy system. I never walk alone, and I always make sure that I'm hyper aware of my surroundings. I also never wear my name tag anymore, and luckily, nothing happened to me, and maybe I was just overthinking the entire experience, I'll admit. But I want to stress that even if your job is in customer service, if someone makes you uncomfortable, it's good to speak up. You shouldn't have to be subjected to this behavior at your work, or anywhere for that matter. So this happened a few months ago. I'm a sophomore in college and was traveling down to my hometown over break. I was having some relationship issues with my stepmom, so I didn't want to stay at my dad's house the night that I arrived at my hometown, so I phoned a friend of mine from high school and asked if I could stay at his place. I knew from social media that he was still in town, and I've stayed at his place before, so I knew that there would be a place for me to stay if they would allow it. My friend, Z, seemed like a pretty normal dude. We weren't best friends or anything, but we were pretty close by the time that we graduated. We would occasionally text or hang out if I was in town and catch up, reminisce on the times that we spent in orchestra or in English class, and when I called, he seemed extremely enthusiastic. Now, Z's normally a pretty upbeat guy, but this time, it seemed like he was getting a brand new car or something, and I didn't think about it at the time, but he said that I could sleep in the guest room, so I just headed over. And when I got to his house, he was just as excited as he was on the phone. He was bringing up stuff to do, like getting high and watching weird movies or playing video games. Z's parents weren't home, so he really wanted the opportunity to smoke. I was pretty tired though from the drive, but since we rarely see each other, I thought a little bit of bonding couldn't hurt. We played some Smash Bros, smoked, and just chatted for a few hours. It was longer than I wanted, I'll admit, but I was having fun, so whatever, right? By the time that it was getting late, around 2 a.m., he started asking some pretty weird questions though. Like, if I ever wondered what it was like to kill someone, or if I thought anyone would miss me if I was gone. This, along with some pretty normal questions, like if I had a boyfriend, or how my parents are doing, or if I'm making any friends at school, gave me a weird feeling. I was confused in the moment, but it didn't really hit me until after that Z could have been assessing me for something bad. But the weirdness of it all just kind of made me want to go to bed. We stopped the game and both went into the basement where his room and the guest room were. We say goodnight and I go to my room and we get ready for bed. I'm having some trouble sleeping, just insomnia that I've had for a while, so I stay awake for around an hour until I hear some movement outside of my room. The walls were pretty thin, so I could hear footsteps walking past my door and up the stairs to the main floor, then back down quickly after that. And what struck me as odd was that I didn't hear the basement door open, which creaks when it does. The light didn't turn on, so I was confused what Z was doing. But I heard him go back to his room, and it was a bit odd, I'll admit, and I had a bit of an odd feeling, but it was nothing beyond that. But it was playing in the back of my head that ever since I had met him this night, he just seemed a lot different than he's ever been. I decided to look him up on social media and Google to see anything out of ordinary, and everything seemed normal. Until I found his Tumblr, which was linked from an inactive Twitter account that I found on my Twitter contact list. And his Tumblr was, well, disturbing. There were graphic drawings of mutilated bodies of humans and animals, links to suspicious-looking websites that I didn't dare click on, text posts and stories about murdering, cannibalism, necrophilia, and torture. There were photos of guns and knives and axes, which, after looking closely, looked like they were actually taken in his bedroom. The last post, around a week prior, was a text post from the account saying that he wished he could find someone easy to kill, like a homeless person. And upon seeing this, I was immediately filled with dread. I knew that he was going to do something. He must have gone up the stairs to lock the door. So I packed my things quietly. Luckily, I packed lightly as well. I opened the small window at the top of my bedroom wall. I started desperately climbing through, and as I was pulling my legs through, he opened the door. It was dark, but the streetlight illuminated enough for me to see that he was carrying something long and shiny, so I can only guess that it was a knife. He didn't say anything, and I didn't say anything. I just turned around, hopped in my car, and I drove as fast as I could to my dad's house. I immediately blocked him everywhere upon getting to my dad's place, and reported his Tumblr account, and not before telling the police. They said that they couldn't really do anything, unfortunately, as the guns were registered under his dad, and plus he hasn't actually done anything yet. Nevertheless, I told my other high school friends not to hang out with Z, and ever since then, I've been pretty creeped out whenever I meet new people. Just the realization that someone that I knew so well could underneath be this person who could hurt me so bad like that, who could potentially kill me. I don't know what you're doing now, Z, but I'm sure that I don't want to know, and I hope that you're getting help. So this just happened tonight, and is obviously really fresh, and I'm freaked out and honestly just quite pissed off. I, a 23 female, met Jason, 29 male, from an app online last September. We clicked immediately, and from then on, went out together about once a week, sometimes twice. We've spent the past year going on dates, out to nice restaurants, garden walks, spending the night, etc., and we established that we had feelings for each other about 2 months into everything, though we had our rocky moments for sure, and I didn't fully trust him. At one point, I wanted to date, but he claimed he was too busy with work, which subsequently caused us to separate for a while. Once we eventually came back together, I told him that I didn't want to be exclusive, but we could still hang out as I enjoyed his company. Now, there has always been some sneaking suspicions on my behalf that there was another partner in his life, because he always paid in cash wherever he went and was very secretive about his private life. I had voiced these thoughts to him, but honestly didn't care too much, because after he told me that he wasn't interested in dating me, I also started seeing another partner and was using protection with both of them. Meanwhile, he didn't want to date me, but raged whenever he thought that there was another man around my life. And he has exhibited some concerning and possessive behaviors, but I let them slide for the most part because I was still doing whatever I wanted. Fast forward to tonight, November 19th of 2019, 14 months after we met. We went to a really nice restaurant downtown after work, and I asked if he wanted to take the subway back to my place since we had a few drinks. We stopped by his car to grab his bag, and off we went to the station. When we got to the station, he said that he forgot his card in his car, and I figured it was no biggie, and I swiped for him. I said that he didn't need to pay me back because it was like $2, but he insisted that he would. When we got back to my apartment, I told him that he was welcome to take a shower, and he went to the bathroom. I was messing on my phone and saw CS had sent me $2 for the train. This was weird to me because his initials are JN, so I clicked on the Venmo friends list and he only had around 20 Venmo friends, so I picked a random person and looked them up on Facebook. I went down their friends list and look at that, a picture of Jason and his brother. The only issue is that the name was Chase Smith. The photo did look a little different because he was about 50 or 60 pounds heavier in the photograph and is currently very fit, but I was 90% sure that it was him. And just to confirm, I googled his name and the area around which he lives, and I got a hit on the white pages. It said that he was related to so-and-so and such, and I remember him telling me that his siblings' names were these. So it turned out that I don't even know the name of the guy that I've been bonking for a year. He got out of the shower, though, and sat on my bed. I was quiet and looked at his face, asking, "Is your real name Chase Smith?" This guy looked me dead in the eye and said, "No." And I can tell you right now that I lost it. Like, I made the leave Britney alone guy look cool and calm and collected, comparatively. I started crying and telling him to get the hell out of my house. He approached me and I told him not to touch me, but he grabbed my wrists and insisted that we talk about it. I told him again to get the hell out of my house and never contact me again. He refused to leave for a while, but eventually did. Afterward, I looked a little deeper and found out that he has criminal records, though I can't see what they were for. But from his past behavior, I'm honestly a little worried for my safety because I immediately blocked him on everything, and I know for a fact that he's going to go apeshit when he realizes that he can't contact me. But everything up to this point has been a lie. Just when you think you know someone, and it turns out that they're probably crazy. So I was in Colorado Springs, CO, with my boyfriend. We were staying with a friend and his girlfriend, Greg and Liz. They lived in an older apartment building, and our friend slept in their bedroom, and we slept in their office. In the office, too, there's a closet where Greg practices witchery and magic and stuff. I have absolutely no idea what exactly that entails, but he's very into all those dark things and otherworldly stuff. I'm a little wooey myself, and nothing he said about it made me uncomfortable. And there wasn't any sort of weird energy in the office, so we blew up a mattress and we laid down for our sleep in Colorado. And as I was falling asleep, it felt like my boyfriend had literally pulled my leg. I'm not sure if this is particularly relevant, but the bottom of the air mattress was right at the sliding doors of the closet. I can only compare this feeling to when you're asleep and you suddenly jolt awake, as if you miss a step and are about to fall. However, I didn't feel like I was falling, only that my leg was being pulled. After realizing my boyfriend was already asleep, I quickly dismissed this as just one of those instances and I fell back asleep. Then, as I'm almost completely back asleep, I have the unmistakable sensation of having tape ripped off of my mouth. I quietly vocalize, "Quit messing with me," and then turned to cuddle my boyfriend and just went back to sleep. I was a little shaken up, I admit, but not so much that it kept me awake. The next day I mentioned it to Greg and Liz, and they seemed surprised. He basically said, "There's nothing unfriendly here," and we just dismissed the topic after that. It's been on my mind now and again, though, and I don't know, I just wanted to share it with someone. So, for additional backstory, my brother was alone at my mum's house, probably to check on our dog Oscar, as both my mum and stepdad worked day jobs, or something along those lines anyway, when the light in our hallway just started turning on and off. My brother began recording in hopes to capture it on video, in which he succeeded. Now, after watching this video countless times, honestly, I'm stumped, and I believe that there's something beyond our knowledge happening here. Having lived in the house for over 2 years myself as well, the house does have weird vibes to it, but I've never personally witnessed something like this. There are 2 light switches that control the light, one closest to my brother and one down at the end of the hallway. You can see in the video it's on the left side of the wall, and you'll also see in the video that the light, it begins to turn on and off, and on 2 separate occasions, you can see the switch literally moving. The first time it goes down perfectly halfway, which is very odd to me and would be damn near impossible to recreate so perfectly with anything tied to the switch. The second time, which is much more obvious, the light slams down, in which my brother reacts appropriately by getting the F out of there. But I want to know what your thoughts and opinions on this video are, and I'm genuinely curious as to what you all think, as my mum still lives in that house and tells me of weird experiences that she's had in it. But anyway, here's the video. So, I apologise in advance for any inconsistencies. I remember the main points, but the details are a bit fuzzy. So when I was 5, my family moved into an apartment with 3 bedrooms, which was pretty exciting for me, because this meant that my 3-year-old sister and I no longer had to share a room. Our parents separated our bunk bed, so we each had a somewhat taller than standard twin bed. One Saturday, I was awake before the arse crack of dawn, as most small kids tend to do on the weekends, and was playing in my room just waiting on everyone else to wake up. And then, just suddenly, there was a really pretty woman with long black hair in my room. I had no fear, no concern, no shock, just felt like it was completely okay and normal for her to be there. I don't remember much specific, but that she was really pretty made me calm and had very long dark hair as well. She told me to go and tell my mum that there's something wrong with her baby, so I did, and when my mum recounts this story, she says that that was the thing that got her attention the most. I always called my sister Sissy, so she thought that it was odd that I would say, there's something wrong with your baby, rather than something more appropriate for 5-year-old me, that is. And it caught her attention enough to get out of her bed and go and check on my 3-year-old sister. Being small kids who were prone to nighttime accidents, we both had the original factory plastic on our mattresses with a waterproof cover on it, and finally the sheet. And in her sleep, my sister had somehow managed to wrap her neck in not only the sheet, but also the cover and the plastic, and was semi-conscious and kind of purplish blue when we found her. She had also managed to scoot herself between the mattress and the headboard, so was wedged half upside down between the bed and the wall, head down. My mum yelled and my dad came in and ended up breaking the headboard to extract my sister, who was thankfully fine. At some point too, I don't remember when, but I told my mum about the lady and how she told me that something was wrong with your baby. I hadn't even actually set foot into my sister's room to see for myself, just went and got my mum after I'd been told to do so. Additionally, a few months or a year or so later, I think, while visiting my grandparents, I ended up finding a picture of the lady with the long dark hair, and it turns out that she was my grandpa's mum, who was mostly Cherokee and had died young from pneumonia. So about a year ago, I had been walking home from work when I saw a yard sale, a half block from my house or so, and I stopped in to check things out and laid my eyes on a painting. The painting was of 4 teddy bears sitting on a red chair in front of a fireplace. The room in the painting was very well lit, except for the top left corner of the room where a shelf was holding a very creepy looking porcelain doll and another teddy. The darkened corner of the painting was what drew my attention the most. When you would look at it, it would just kind of give you a bit of a sense of dread and anxiety. But the weirdest part of the whole painting was that I felt that I had to bring it home with me, so much so that I felt like I would regret it if I didn't. So, needless to say, I bought it. I brought the painting home and I showed it to my wife. She liked it a lot too, so we decided to hang it above our bed. But within a couple of days of having this painting, the atmosphere of our room had really started to change. It went from a very comfortable home-like vibe to a very sad and angry atmosphere to it. We had also noticed that whenever we'd have a nap or go to bed or something, we would have some of the most terrifying dreams that anyone could think of. Dreams just made of pure evil, to say the least. And then it got really bad after about a week and a half of having it. So, My wife was in the living room and I was in the kitchen cooking some dinner when we hear a loud thud. I look into the living room to see our copy of H.P. Lovecraft's Necronomicon had flown about 4 feet from the bookshelf that it was on. My wife actually saw it fling itself off the shelf, so us having had many experiences with the paranormal before, we weren't too bothered, especially because we already knew that our house was haunted, so we just thought it was this kid playing a joke or something. Fast forward 2 days after the bookshelf incident had occurred, and now I'm home alone. My wife was out of town at her parents', and I was getting ready for work, when I hear a loud thud coming from the living room again. I go downstairs in a bit of a rush, I'm running late for work, and see that not only has the same book been flung off the damn shelf again, but so has the Book of Osiris, Egyptian Lord of the Underworld, also. As I said, I was running a little late for work, so I didn't bother picking them up. I just left them on the ground where they were, and when I got home from work about 6 hours later, I noticed that the books are back on the shelf where they were flung from like nothing had happened. And I can assure you that nobody was home to put them back there. But things would get worse. Another couple of days down the road, and my wife's back from her parents'. It's late and she's asleep. I'm not yet. I'm playing PS4 in the living room when my wife comes downstairs just in hysterics. I ask her what's the matter and why she's so scared, and she proceeds to tell me that she was half woken up by me crawling into the bed, picking her up a little, and moving her over a bit, and hearing who she thought was me in her sleepiness whisper, "Move over," in her ear. In her half-sleep state, she rolled over to give me a kiss and saw that there was no one in the room with her. So, who actually moved her and spoke to her like that? That made her panic and run down to me to explain what had happened. After I had calmed her down, I went to go and get the painting, as I had finally put 2 and 2 together that this messed up stuff was only happening since the painting came into our home. And when I got up to the room, it was no longer on the wall, and it was now on the floor, far away from where it was hung. And the strange thing, though, was that there was no crash or bang from it falling, which meant that something had to have picked it up and moved it carefully. And it definitely wasn't my wife, as she had bolted out of the room to get me. Well, we did an almost 3-hour-long smudging of the house and painting, and then we buried the painting in the potato field behind our house. After we did the smudging and the burying of the painting, everything just went back to normal. We have since moved from that house, but I'll never forget what went down there. So I was about 17 years old, and I was dog-sitting for a family friend across town. I had my driver's license at this point, and had driven to the home where the dog lived to take her for a walk and put her in a crate at home. I had worked that afternoon. At the time, it was about 3 p.m., I think, at my retail job, and wanted to make sure that the dog was taken care of and safe while I was gone for a few hours. So I walked her around and brought her home, locking up behind me. I got in my minivan and I headed down the road. I hadn't gotten far when I came upon a stop sign. I slowed to a halt and I noticed a man waiting on the crosswalk. He was probably in his late 40s or maybe early 50s, had a hood on and a full jacket, odd because it was summer, and had a scraggly beard. I made sure to have my vehicle at a full stop before waving him on, gesturing him that I saw him and was going to wait for him to cross before making my left turn that I was signalling for. He nodded at me and began to walk across the street. Mind you, my car was at a full stop, and my foot was on the brake the whole time. And when the man was about halfway across the walkway, he stopped and jumped back, as if my car had started moving. I knew that it hadn't, and was immediately confused. Maybe there was something on the road? I didn't know. What I did know, though, was that I hadn't budged from my stopped position. I looked at him, and he continued to look at me, and began screaming and swearing. My windows were up, so I couldn't make out much, but from what I could hear and what I could read on his lips, a lot of swearing was coming from him, and he looked really angry. The only explanation that I could think of was that I had somehow bumped him with my car, but I knew that I hadn't. So I stayed where I was, and I again waved him on, trying to show that he needed to move and that I was going to wait for him. He took a few more steps before throwing himself back again, grabbing his leg and hobbling around as though it was broken. And at this point, I felt a strange feeling in my stomach. I didn't know what was wrong with this man, but I knew that something wasn't right. I mean, there was no way that I had done anything, and he was walking just fine until he was in front of my car and I couldn't see his legs. But what he did next is what makes this so scary. The man started to come at my passenger door, arms waving while jumping on one foot, not resting his other leg on the ground at all. I looked away from him, staring straight ahead and making sure my doors were locked. He stopped before reaching my door and began gesturing for me to come out. At this point, because I was so close, I could hear him, and he was saying, "My leg, please help me. I think you hit me." And my blood ran cold, and I refused to acknowledge him. I made sure that he was far enough away, and I slowly stepped on the gas, taking the left turn. I dialed my mum and told her about what happened, and how the whole thing was just so incredibly strange. And she immediately confirmed what I had feared was the truth. The man was probably trying to lure me out of my car. He definitely was not injured, and even if he was, I definitely wasn't responsible. He had seen that I was a small 17-year-old girl, and probably wanted to take advantage of someone young who might not know better. Immediately, we decided that I should file a police report. I called my local station, and they wanted me to come in person and describe the incident. I gave a detailed report, and they said that they would keep an eye out. Nothing ever did come of it, but sometimes I still wonder if he ever did attempt that stunt with anybody else. Was it premeditated, or was it simply an opportunity that he saw? Either way, I sincerely hope that I never see this guy again. So previously, I shared a story about my creepy encounter as a pizza deliverer driver to the basement of some place, and I was a pizza driver for about 4 years, so needless to say, I've come across plenty of strange customers. Also, I'm a small female, so I don't come across very intimidating for sure. But I wanted to share one more story because this encounter would be the reason why I quit my job as a pizza deliverer for good. So again, my shift was always from 6 p.m. to midnight because I had a day job. Late one night, I had a delivery to the same bad part of town. Usually I'm a lot more alert of my surroundings, but that night I wasn't because I was tired. It was pretty late and the streets were pretty quiet. I knew exactly where I was delivering to though because he was a regular customer. So I'm driving on my way there and I stop at a red light in the middle of a hill. As I'm waiting impatiently for it to turn green, I see a person walking about a block away in the direction of my car. It was dark, so it was hard to get a good description of what he looked like. I could just see his movements, but he stopped walking, lifted something up, and in very slow motion, I hear a really loud bang, and my window on my driver's side completely shatters just all over me. I then see him run towards me really quickly. I stepped on my gas and I sped off, and I drove past my customer's house and stopped about a mile away. And it was at that moment that I called my boss and I told him that I quit. I drove home shaking, but thankful to be alive. My family is my witness to this because they took pictures of all the broken glass and helped me clean it out of my car the next day. But that was the closest that I've been to dying. So I rent this house, but it's been in the family of my landlord, Nancy, since it was built in 1929. She lives on 1.5 acres behind me in her own home, and she also owns the house next to mine on the corner. Her house was built on family land in the 1980s, and there's approximately 35 acres of bean farm that is also a part of this large plot that I live on. So, the home that I live in is in the original farmhouse for the Miller family here in northwestern Ohio. Now, we, my husband, our 2 kids, our dog and I, moved in here on the 1st of April of this year. It's a quaint little farmhouse with 2 bedrooms, original shiplap along the mudroom walk, and original millwork along the window casing the floorboards. The newest part of the home is the garage, which is completely made of cinder block and no frills. I absolutely love old homes with the original details, and we've been fixing it up a bit as Nancy, our landlord, is suffering from some sort of a cancer, and I want to make sure that she's looking after herself and not worrying about us or some peeling latex paint on the doors or whatnot. So, everything was normal about this place, aside from well water issues that were quickly fixed with the installation of a water softener, but we really enjoyed being here. Like I said, it's a quaint little house just big enough for us, and I love living here. Until one morning while I was getting ready for school. So, I'm going back to school for a degree in physical therapy, after not being able to find a job in my original major, early childhood education. I get up every morning at the same time, 6 o'clock, and this particular morning, my husband, who's a police officer, had the day off, so he was going to let our kids sleep in with him instead of making me haul them off in the dark to the sitter's house. I was getting dressed in our living room as to not wake my husband or my son, who likes to co-sleep, with the lights on in our room, when I saw it. The door to my child's room was open, and someone was standing there, staring at me, half hiding behind the doorframe. That someone was about a head taller than either of my children, with a full head of dirty blonde curls, and in a second it slowly pulled its head back and just vanished. Now, my daughter's bed is up against the wall, and the foot of her bed is right at the doorframe to accommodate both twin-size beds, and their dressers in the same room as well. So, there's just no way that anyone could stand at the end of her bed and hide behind the doorframe at the same time. I raced into her room, though, and not only was my daughter asleep at the top of her bed, but she was holding a giant cow stuffed animal, and they were both tucked in. I woke my husband up, and he saw that I was visibly shaken. He said my pupils were huge, and I was shaking, and after explaining what I saw, he went in to check for himself, and when he came back, I wasn't in any shape better. He asked me if he should treat me for shock, and I said no, but I know what I saw. This all happened about 2 months ago, though, and the reason that I'm sharing this now is because, well, another incident happened tonight to my husband. So he was brushing my daughter's hair after her bath, and he said that a black shadow crossed the threshold in my children's bedroom, and he yelled for me. The goosebumps were just all over his arms and legs, and my daughter was asking, "Who's in there, Dad?" She's 3 years old. Then, as we're putting them to sleep, a little Tyke's toy circus goes off on top of their toy box several times. My husband calls me from the bathroom to come and see what's happening, and it goes off one last time while I'm approaching it. None of their toys have ever gone off by themselves since moving here, especially not this one. It's a tiny circus that only makes music when the little acrobat is on the tightrope and you lift one side to make him slide across. We do plan on installing cameras to their room and the toy area to keep monitoring this situation this weekend. And if possible, I'll make sure I send you guys the findings. But the 1929 farmhouse seems to have come with a lot more than what was listed in the rental agreement. So my dad was a pastor at a church for 4 years. Many people died in this church before we got there, and over the course of these 4 years, some of the craziest, just most unexplainable stuff happened, and I'm here to tell all of you the best ones. So, my parents went to Maine every year. I gotten tired of the trip and decided to stay home this year. I went over to the church to grab some snacks from the back of the old sanctuary. There were 2 sanctuaries. One was about 90 years old, and the newer one was about 50 years old. So I went to the back of it where the snack booth was. Mind you, this is in the middle of the day, so it was completely lit up through the old stained glass windows. I bent down to grab some drinks from the mini fridge under the counter, and when I got back up and turned to walk out the door, I saw this figure standing in the doorway. No eyes, no mouth, no nose, no ears, just a bald head wearing a long dark robe. As soon as I saw it, it vanished just like that, but safe to say that I ran out of there as fast as I could. Another time, my cousin came over to spend the night at my house. We wanted to play PS4, but the other controller was over in the church, So we walked across the yard into the church. It was pitch black out. When we opened the door of the church, we might have made it 2 or 3 feet in, I think, before we heard the loudest, blood-curdling scream that I've ever heard from the back of the new sanctuary. We ran out of that door and back into my house so quickly that I don't even know if I touched the ground. My cousin was on the verge of crying and saying that he was never going back in that church again. The church also had this preschool in it too. They would change out the toys in the classes every now and then so that the kids wouldn't get bored of the old ones. And one time, the teacher took one of the kids upstairs to help her pick some toys out for the rest of the class. These old classes upstairs were used for storage of preschool toys, extra chairs, old desks at the time, so there was no one else up there except for them. When the teacher was grabbing some of the toys, the kid that she brought up to help said, "Hey, look at those kids playing with those toys over there." When the teacher looked over there was nobody there. These are just a couple of the stories, and I could sit here all day and write the hundreds of experiences that I've had in this church, but I don't really have the time for that. But if you guys want to hear some more stories, please let me know in the comment section below, and I'll share a few more.